Thank you for joining today's event. I'm Christine Hunter, the Acting Director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research at the National Institutes of Health. Our annual Matilda White Riley event is always one of the highlights of the year for me. It is so gratifying to learn from and honor the distinguished lecturer, as well as hear the presentations from the up-and-coming leaders in the behavioral and social sciences. I hope you find the session a highlight for you as well. Today's event is being recorded, and I saw the message, so it is. And the recording will be available in about 1 month on the OBSSR website at obssr.od.nih.gov. Today's half-day event features a keynote address from the 2022 Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. David R. Williams from Harvard University, and highlights innovative research from 5 early-stage investigators, or ESIs as we call them. And these honorees were selected out of more than 250 submissions to our ESI paper competition. Each paper was reviewed and rated based on 3 guiding questions influenced by Dr. Matilda White Riley's scientific legacy. The first was, how well does the paper use sophisticated methodological approaches to address important empirical questions that are derived from or that inform theoretical frameworks? The second was, how well does the paper integrate multiple levels of influence and or the dynamic, longitudinal, and bidirectional effects of social systems on the individuals and vice versa? And then finally, how well does the paper integrate approaches from multiple disciplines to address the research question? Congratulations to today's 5 ESI honorees, Drs. Noli Brazil, Aytac Kristoff, Patricia Homan, John Jackson, and Alina Palamaru. Each presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. All attendees are muted during the webinar, and so questions and comments will be taken via the Zoom chat feature. So once chat is selected, use the drop-down menu with the chat to select everyone and then send your questions. Questions will be compiled and then directed to the presenters to answer, and those will be handled by the moderator. Feel free to send a question at any time during the event. OBSSR's Drs. Bill Elwood and Erica Spotts will moderate the ESI and Distinguished Lecturer presentations respectively. They will facilitate the Q&A sessions, and as I said, they'll ask your questions to the presenters, so just keep them coming in the chat. OBSSR's Dr. Wendy Smith will deliver the closing remarks and will share an update on upcoming OBSSR events. Thank you again for joining today's 15th Matilda White Riley Behavioral and Social Science Honors. We hope you enjoy today's event. Now I turn it over to Bill Riley, Dr. Bill Riley.
Thanks so much, Dr. Hunter. Within a 20-minute framework, a question and answer session will be followed by each ESI's presentation. As Dr. Hunter told you, you may ask a question at any time during the presentations. To ask that question or send a comment, click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, type your question, and hit send. I'm excited to introduce today's 2022 NIH Matilda White Riley Early Stage Investigator honorees. This was an extremely competitive year in submissions that resulted in the selection of these 5 ESI honorees. Our first presenter is Dr. Noli Brazil, an assistant professor in the Department of Human Ecology at the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on revealing understudied patterns, causes, and consequences of neighborhood inequality in cities and metropolitan areas. He examines spatial inequity across multiple ecological dimensions, including transportation, health, environmental, economic, education, and crime. The rationale driving this comprehensive and transdisciplinary approach is the perspective that neighborhoods are shaped by multiple ecological factors, and in turn shape multiple outcomes, including well-being. Dr. Brazil earned his Ph.D. in demography from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MS in statistics from Stanford. Before coming to UC Davis, he held postdoctoral fellowships at the Center for Research on Inequalities and the Life Course at Yale University and the Spatial Sciences Institute at the University of Southern California. Dr. Brazil's presentation is titled The Multidimensional Clustering of Health and Its Ecological Risk Factors. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Brazil.
Great. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. All right, I will play from the start. All right, so thank you and good day to everyone for attending this event. Thank you, Bill, for that wonderful introduction. I thank the Office of Behavioral Social Sciences Research and the NIH for granting me this wonderful award. I'm extremely humbled by this inclusion, and I thank the organizers for putting this event together. And also I congratulate the other awardees for receiving this prestigious honor. As Bill mentioned, the title of my paper, and thus the title of my talk today, is the multidimensional clustering of health and its ecological risk factors. All right, there we go. So very broadly, my research focuses on place inequality. I examine the causes of place inequality and its consequences on health. This interest draws from a long line of research that has shown that the places where people live matters in their health and well-being. Now, because the places of low income and minority populations tend to be considerably more disadvantaged than those of comparable higher income and white populations, exposure to adverse place conditions help explain these socioeconomic and racial inequalities. As such, there's growing recognition in research, policy, and practice that adequately addressing these stubborn health inequalities require approaches that move beyond standard interventions. And there are a number of theories and frameworks that have been established in the literature that can help us go beyond and expand traditional understandings of health inequality. First, syndemic theory highlights how synergistic interactions among psychosocial and biological conditions underlie patterns of disease clustering or co-occurrence. Next, the social determinants of health framework argues that upstream contextual determinants that reflect the economic and social resources and opportunities influencing residents' access to health promoting living and healthy choices strongly shape ecological health and well-being. Next, spatial dependency advances the notion that disease and their contextual risk factors are geographically concentrated. And finally, social network perspectives seek to understand how health conditions and their risk factors can spread across a social network, defined not simply by direct kin ties, but also by ties extending to several degrees of separation. So these four perspectives all have similar underlying empirical and theoretical underpinnings, namely that health disparities are a consequence of disadvantage being embedded within self-reinforcing structures. Despite this shared connection or this orientation, these frameworks oftentimes do not speak to one another. And consequently, without accounting for clustering across these multiple structures, we are underestimating the health burden experienced in certain areas of the country. As such, in this paper, I examine the magnitude and extent of clustering and health outcomes and their ecological risk factors across four specific dimensions: co-occurrence, spatial, temporal, and network. And so the conceptual model advanced in this paper is presented here without any reference to specific contextual factors, geographic context, and health outcomes. The gray polygons in this figure represent geographic areas such as counties, with arrows depicting associations within and between geographic areas. And the black arrows represent the pathways captured by each dimension of clustering. So drawing from syndemic theory and the social determinants of health framework, figure A in this slide depicts co-occurrence, which is the concomitant association between multiple health outcomes and its risk factors in a given place and time. Figure B depicts temporal clustering, which measures the persistence of health outcomes and their health risk factors across time. Figure C depicts spatial dependency or spatial clustering. The spatial dependency literature has demonstrated that health outcomes and their risk factors in areas as small as census tracts and as large as counties are associated with outcomes and factors in geographically adjacent areas. And finally, figure D depicts network clustering, which measures the synergistic interaction of health and community level factors between communities connected via economic, political, and demographic pathways that are not simply governed by geographic proximity. So the study's objective is to demonstrate that community level health and its ecological risk factors are clustered across these four dimensions. In this study, I examined for a variety of population level health outcomes and their ecological risk factors, which of these typically co-occur, how correlated or associated are they across time, how correlated are they across spatial boundaries, and how correlated are they across network pathways. So in order to fulfill this research objective, I relied on the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's County Health Rankings Framework, a widely accepted model given its comprehensiveness, reliance on publicly available data, and its theoretical grounding via a rigorous review of the population health literature. In this project, I adopt this model to select the specific health outcomes and ecological risk factors for the analysis. Here, I rely on the 2015 and 2018 versions of the CHR datasets, which draws on variables that measures outcomes and factors across a roughly decade-long period. My unit of analysis here is the county, using all 3,100 plus counties in the contiguous US. And the CHR uses several health outcomes, which are listed here on this slide, an index combining 4 variables to measure overall quality of life, the percent of residents reporting fair and poor health, the average number of physically and mentally unhealthy days, and the percent of live births with low birth weight. And I also examined diabetes prevalence and the age-adjusted mortality rate. The CHR model identifies 13 health risk factors organized under 4 broad categories: health behaviors, clinical care, social and economic factors, and the physical environment. Each risk factor is represented by a range of individual measures, which I standardize and average to obtain 13 subdomain indices. For example, access to care under the clinical care domain includes the proportion of residents that are uninsured and the ratio of the resident population to primary care physicians and mental health providers. I use descriptive correlations and spatial and network methods to measure clustering across the 4 dimensions I examined in this study. I measured co-occurrence 2 ways. First, I calculated Pearson correlation coefficients of health outcomes and their determinants. Next, I performed a geodemographic analysis, which is a clustering procedure that organizes each county into groups based upon their overall similarities across a large set of multivariate attributes. The goal with this analysis is to determine which unique bundles of outcomes and risk factors hang together. Here, I used hierarchical clustering to determine the classes, whereby classes are determined by minimizing within class differences and maximizing between class differences, with the aim of finding the number of groups that best separates counties into distinct classes. So in addition to CHR's 13 domains, I included a set of demographic variables such as racial ethnic composition in this clustering procedure. To measure temporal clustering, I examined Pearson correlation coefficients of health outcomes and their ecological risk factors across 2 time periods. To measure spatial clustering, I examined the Moran's I, the spatial equivalent to the Pearson correlation for each health outcome and health factor. The Moran's I is a standard measure of spatial autocorrelation, with values ranging from -1 to 1, with positive values suggesting spatially clustered patterns in bordering areas. Now, in this present study, I examined social network clustering via a particular pathway connecting communities both near and far, specifically migration flows. The justification for examining migration flows stems in part from the observation that health outcomes and their health factors are not airborne phenomena that disperse across spatial boundaries. Rather, people move, taking their health and behaviors with them. And so from a network perspective, the choice to move to a certain county is shaped not just by individual happenstance or spatial proximity, but also meso and macro level institutional ties and processes such as segregation, gentrification, and broader housing policies. So the strength of the connection between 2 counties is defined by the number of migrants moving from county to county. The more residents moving from one county to another, the stronger the network connection. And so here in the study, I used US Census county to county migration flows data to measure migration flows for every county pair in the contiguous US. And to measure the correlation across these networks, I used Moran's I to measure the migration network clustering. So here are the first set of results shown in this slide. This figure visually summarizes the co-occurrence of the 3 health outcomes and 13 health risk factors I study in this analysis through a correlation matrix. I transformed all ecological factors such that greater values indicate poorer conditions. Darker colors here indicate higher correlations, and only coefficient values with p-values less than 0.01 are shown. So with the exception of air and water quality and access to clinical care, the plot broadly shows strongly statistically significant correlations amongst the ecological risk factors. There's also strong co-occurrence between the 3 health outcomes, correlation values of 0.87, 0.68, and 0.71 for mortality and overall health, mortality and diabetes prevalence and overall health, respectively. So this map displays the locations of the 8 clusters produced through a geodemographic classification using the 13 health risk factors and various demographic characteristics. The clusters here are labeled according to their most distinguishing features. For example, there's a cluster of counties in the middle of the US that are shaded in teal. That are defined as rural, white, older age, and ranks highly in the social, economic, physical environment, and healthy behaviors domains. So a few important findings emerge from this geodemographic classification. First, separation is largely based on the interactions between a county's health risk factors and its racial and ethnic composition and rurality. That is, it is not just a variation in how health risk factors co-occur that differentiates counties, but how this co-occurrence interacts with a county's racial and ethnic composition and level of rurality. Furthermore, counties are not universally categorized into health enhancing or diminishing classes, but are separated by groups of characteristics that often co-vary in opposite directions. For example, the analysis identified a group of racially, ethnically diverse urban counties with positive health behaviors, but poor physical environments. Furthermore, the class is spatially clustered or geographically clustered. So these findings show that it's not simply the case that counties can be categorized into those that have health enhancing or health diminishing factors. Instead, counties are grouped together based on distinct packages of ecological risk factors and demographic characteristics, some enhancing and others diminishing. Having established strong co-occurrence amongst the health outcomes and their ecological factors, here I present results examining clustering at the other three levels: temporal, geographic, and network. The table here shows correlations of health and ecological risk factors organized by the CHR's 4 umbrella categories. And in general, the correlations are relatively strong in magnitude, with many above 0.5 and nearly all statistically significant at the 0.01 level. For example, health outcomes correlate at a low of 0.39 and a high of 0.8. Once again, 0.89, I should say. Once again, all statistically significant at the 0.01 level. Here, quality of clinical care is correlated at a low of 0.29 at the network level and a high of 0.85 at the temporal level. So generally speaking, correlations are lower for the network compared to the spatial and temporal, but all the correlations, with the exception of access to clinical care, are statistically significant, with most greater than 0.3 and many greater than 0.5 in magnitude. So having established that health outcomes and their ecological risk factors cluster across temporal, geographic, and network pathways through the set of correlations and the clustering technique I showed in prior slides, I then next modeled the consequences of this clustering on county level health. Specifically, I examined the average associations between a county's health and the health outcomes and the risk factors in that county's temporal, spatial, and network neighbors using a set of spatial and network regression models. The models generally take on the following form shown here, where Y is the health outcome regressed on ecological factors X, the lag of Y, and the lag of X, with the lags representing past health and ecological risk factors for temporal, average health and ecological risk factors of a county's geographic neighbors for spatial, and average health and ecological risk factors of a county's migration network for network. So I don't show the full set of results here, but instead highlight several findings from this analysis. First, the multivariate models support the simple correlations I showed in the prior slides. County level health is correlated across temporal, spatial, and network pathways for all health outcomes. In terms of the risk factors, housing and transit quality, alcohol and drug use, family and social support, and diet and exercise are associated with health across all health outcomes and across all forms of structural embeddedness. And finally, the lag effects of the other ecological factors vary across health outcome and clustering type. So in conclusion, I find support that health and its risk factors cluster across a number of self-reinforcing structures. Not only do health outcomes and their ecological risk factors cluster within counties, supporting the co-occurrence that's provided by the syndemic theory, but also between geographically adjacent counties and counties connected via migration network pathways. Furthermore, these self-reinforcing structures persist over time, and these results are true for all the outcomes studied in this paper, as well as nearly all the 13 ecological risk factor domains. So the main takeaway here is that rather than adopting the perspective that either health and its community level factors should be broadly targeted and detached from local contexts, or otherwise communities are different, have unique needs, and thus should be treated in isolation, the approach advanced in the study identifies shared vulnerabilities in a way that allows for the development of knowledge networks between communities dealing with similar issues. Scholars and practitioners should then move beyond the evaluation and targeting of single outcomes, determinants, and communities, and acknowledge and leverage the observation here that health and its ecological risk factors are clustered phenomena across multiple forms of embeddedness. Some key implications emerge from the study's findings. First, the study highlights that disadvantage is reinforced across multiple embedded structures, and thus ignoring one or more of these structures underestimates a community's disease burden, and thus may help explain persistent health inequalities within those communities. Second, spatial, network, temporal, and co-occurrence clusters can provide appropriate comparison groups that health agencies can use for benchmarking as a forum for learning exchange, through which the lowest performers within a cluster can gain valuable information on how to improve their performance by implementing similar interventions as the highest performers in that cluster. And then finally, a major contribution of the study is to show how the separate yet interrelated frameworks presented earlier in this presentation can be expanded by integrating other forms of health clustering. Here, interventions can thus tackle more than one form of embeddedness. For example, the study's findings expand the syndemic and traditional social determinants of health frameworks by demonstrating that co-occurrence and the influence of risk factors is not a strictly internal or within community process. The study demonstrates that health outcomes and ecological risk factors also cluster between counties via spatial and network pathways. Here, the study highlights the spatial and network dimensions of co-occurrence. In terms of future directions for my research, I have a set of papers and projects that are springboarding from this paper, but going at the more local scale. I study neighborhoods, as was elucidated before my presentation. And so I'm going to examine sort of the different scales of neighborhood inequality, looking at sort of these different ways of understanding embeddedness. For example, I recently published a paper in PNAS that utilizes cell phone data that tracks people's mobility from neighborhood to neighborhood. So creating a neighborhood network and understanding the exposure to different outcomes across these networks. In particular, for this paper, I answered the question, what are the levels of exposure to air pollution levels for residents residing in Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, poor, and non-poor neighborhoods? And I compared that level of exposure across residential, adjacent, and a network of neighborhoods that residents move to for work or move around for work, school, errands, and leisure. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you all for your time and patience, and I look forward to any comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brazil. As the questions roll in, I might ask of your more recent paper in PNAS, in your ESI winning paper, you focused on the multiple inequalities. With the mobility data, were there any suggestions of potential strengths to build upon? That people, for example, travel to other parts of the metropolitan area that might have health benefits?
Yeah, what I found, sort of two things I found in that analysis. Number one, that residents across all different types of neighborhoods do travel to different parts of the metropolitan area. So they're just not secluded to just their own neighborhood or adjacent neighborhoods, but they actually travel pretty wide and far. And that's true across all the race, ethnic, and socioeconomic indicators. And the second thing that I found is that prior work has generally shown that there's higher levels of exposure to air pollution for minority and poor neighborhoods. I also found that same level of inequality exists when you look at the adjacent neighborhoods, which also is not super surprising, but also in the neighborhoods that residents travel to throughout the metropolitan area. So in other words, inequality sort of embedded within these three structures, both where you live, the neighborhood surrounding where you live, and also the neighborhoods that you travel to throughout the area.
The things that I'm going through, and so we've been kind of talking about that, and so.
Oh, thank you for cutting off. Two questions. Well, first, that was a very powerful finding you just mentioned, that chronic stressors of endure regardless of where they travel. We have a question about explaining the method of cell phone data tracking across and how they track community characteristics.
Yeah, so the data that I rely on is coming from SafeGraph, and that data allows you, it captures about 30 million devices in the US, and I looked at that data from 2018 and 19, so before COVID and the pandemic, where everyone, or not everyone, but a lot of people were sort of isolated within their own neighborhoods. And they track locations from residential, where they live, to points of interest across the city or metropolitan area. So places like schools, where you go to work, where you buy your groceries, parks, and so forth. And what I do is I don't have individual level data, so I can't, that data is not captured. So what I do is I look at the neighborhoods that are majority Black, majority white, majority Asian, majority Hispanic, and percent poverty greater than 30% and less than 30%. Where do residents from those neighborhoods travel to? So it's more of a neighborhood level analysis as opposed to an individual level analysis, but still gives you a sense of people living in these sort of majority minority, majority poor areas. Where are they sort of traveling to, and what are they being exposed to? In this case, air pollution is a clear outcome. You go to that place, you're exposed to it, especially if you're outdoors, especially if you're going there for a park, or you're just sort of traveling there and walking around. And so that's sort of how I captured what I captured in that analysis. And I have a set of studies that I'm hoping to continue moving forward that looks at other different outcomes besides air pollution, things such as extreme heat, measures of crime, and other forms of negative health exposures.
Okay, we have a number of questions coming in now, but if we have time for a group discussion afterwards, we'll bring those up. Now, thank you so much, Noli. Great job. And Aytac Kristoff, Ph.D., is our next speaker. He's incoming assistant professor at McGill University and currently serves as assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Wake Forest University. Dr. Kristoff received his Ph.D. in developmental psychology from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. His research uses a variety of quantitative methods to focus on the impact of discrimination on the psychological well-being of minoritized youth across development, as well as individual, familial, and contextual cultural factors that may promote well-being and provide resilience in the face of discrimination. Dr. Kristoff will present Shift and Persist and Discrimination Predicting Depression Across the Life Course, an accelerated longitudinal design using MIDAS 1 through 3. Dr. Kristoff, won't you please begin?
Awesome, thanks for the introduction, Bill. Let me go and share my screen. Awesome. So again, I'm really honored to receive one of these ESI awards, and congrats to all the other recipients as well. Super excited to talk with you all today about my study titled Shift and Persist Discrimination, Predicting Depression Across the Life Course, Accelerated Design using MIDAS 1 through 3. So as Dr. David Williams, which we'll talk about at the end of these presentations, discrimination, whether it's based on race, ethnicity, or other forms of discrimination targeting other identities, it's a really pernicious and harmful social stressor associated across the life course with poor physical and psychological health. We also know that exposure to discrimination changes across the life course as well. And to the right, I've highlighted a study by Gilbert G. and colleagues looking at age-based discrimination among a sample of working women followed for 2 decades. So you can see clear differences in the levels of exposure to age-based discrimination that sample has. Knowing that discrimination is a harmful stressor and its exposure differs through the life course, one might ask, does its impact on psychological functioning differ as well as a function of the life course? And this really keys into this idea of sensitive periods for discrimination. You all might be more familiar with sensitive periods as developmentalists, thinking of like prenatal or infant development. But again, Gilbert G. and colleagues talked about Sensitive periods for discrimination being those where discrimination is particularly harmful and particularly predictive of a certain outcome during one period of the life course or several periods of life course relative to others. And research really hasn't done a great job of capturing this thus far. I want to highlight one study by Kessler, which looked at, did as a cross-sectional study of wave 1 of the MIDAS data that I'll be talking more about. And ultimately, they found that frequency of discrimination, regardless of its attribution, was lower among older adults compared to younger adults, but that the impact on mental functioning was the same. So again, that's maybe initial evidence that these sensitive periods don't exist, but again, it's a cross-sectional design and we're looking at differences between people. We really need to follow this up with in-person longitudinal examinations to look for these sensitive periods, is what my study does. Thinking a little bit more about a specific mental health outcome that's very, very tightly coupled with discrimination is depressive symptoms. And looking a little bit to the life stress literature, found that potentially midlife was emerging as a possible sensitive period where stressors might be particularly predictive of greater depressive symptomatology. So on the right is an empirically derived graph by Mazur and Maciejewski showing that in the midlife periods of between ages 40 and 50, you can see in the circled area that negative life events have the highest odds of leading to onsets of depressive episodes during that time period relative to all other time periods in the life course. Similarly, the stress sensitization model of depression by Monroe and Harkness says that compared to younger individuals, older adults and adults as they age become more physiologically, biologically sensitized, where chronic and daily stressors, of which I would include discrimination, is more likely to lead to onsets and marked increases in depressive symptoms. So again, we're thinking potentially about that midlife time as a time where discrimination might exert a particularly harmful influence. Thinking about risk factors like discrimination, I also think it's equally as if not more important to think about protective factors and what factors might need to come online during these sensitive periods to mitigate the impact of discrimination. And in this study, I was particularly focused on looking at one called shift and persist coping. So shift and persist coping is a style of coping proposed to help marginalized individuals effectively deal with uncontrollable stressors, so stressors like the negative effects of poverty and discrimination. Shift and persist specifically involves these two aspects. So there's this cognitive reappraisal or kind of reframing and acceptance of uncontrollable stress, combined with a persistence or a real maintenance of optimism and subjective feelings of purpose, meaning in life, and a positive orientation towards the future, despite your exposure to largely uncontrollable stressors. Shift and persist has been shown to be protective against the effects of poverty on numerous health outcomes, inflammation, allostatic load, diurnal cortisol rhythms. And in some of my work and others, we found that shift and persist can also protect against the impacts of discrimination on health outcomes such as asthma-related impairment and depressive symptomatology. So taking together interest in looking at discrimination throughout the life course, its potentially variable impacts on depression, and then protective factors such as shift and persist led me to these primary research questions. The first is, what is that average trajectory of depression across the life course? And how might discrimination at different periods of the life course lead to deviations, or what I call kind of peaks and valleys above or below where we expect that trajectory, where we expect people to be on that trajectory of depressive symptoms? And then the second question is really a kind of sensitive period question. Are there certain times in life course development when the effects of discrimination and shift and persist might be particularly salient? Again, thinking of that midlife period as a potential sensitive period. So to answer these questions, it utilized a publicly available data set, the Midlife in the United States study, nationally representative sample, where the main data collection occurred over 3 waves of data collection, each spaced about 10 years apart. The sample for this study is a subsample of about 3,700 adults in the United States who are between ages 20 and 49 at wave 1. To speak a little bit to the racial ethnic composition, MIDAS has a very, very large proportion of white individuals, so used what are called sampling or post-stratification weights to partially correct for that and actually increase the influence that minoritized individuals had in the calculation of model parameters. I'll move over the measures fairly quickly, but we utilize the everyday discrimination measure by Dr. Williams. And the discrimination that individuals reported on in the sample was mostly gender and race-based. And finally, to talk about the methods a little bit, used latent growth curve modeling to assess that trajectory of depressive symptoms, and then was the first to use what's called an accelerated longitudinal design in the MIDAS data. And to kind of explain what that type of design is, I think it's useful to kind of briefly go over a traditional longitudinal design with 3-wave data. We think of a typical longitudinal design. We have individuals assessed 3 times, about 10 years apart each time. So we have 3 waves over 20 years. But because we have so many different ages represented at each wave of data collection, there's a problem if we want to think about things developmentally. And that problem is our change over time, so our change across waves, is actually confounded with developmental change. So essentially, we're averaging the changes that a 21-year-old goes through aging up to 41 with the changes that a 47-year-old goes to aging up to 67. Developmentally, we would say those parts of the life course are different, so we should probably disaggregate those. And that's exactly what accelerated longitudinal design does. It involves this reorganization of your data into a structure where instead of looking at changes across waves of data collection, you can actually look at changes across all of the ages represented across waves of data. So what I was able to do is use this to look at trajectories of depressive symptoms over all of the ages represented, age 20 all the way to age 69, and then look decade by decade to see whether discrimination, shift and persist, and the interaction between those two impacted whether people fell above or below their predicted, above or below where they were expected to fall on depressive symptoms based on their overall trajectory. What did I actually find? First found evidence for significant downward trajectory of depressive symptoms across decades. So from the 20s through the 60s, we'd anticipate about a 0.2 standard deviation decrease in people's depressive symptoms, okay? But when you added discrimination into the model, we found that in each decade of life, so in the 20s through the 60s, participants who faced discrimination displayed a greater number of depressive symptoms than expected during each decade of life. So instead of going on that typical 0.2 standard deviation decrease across that trajectory, they were going down, but then getting bumped up due to their exposure to discrimination during that decade. I think it's important to note that these findings are controlling for a number of covariates dealing with the MIDAS sample, sex, nativity status, race, education, and other intra-individual factors like neuroticism. Speaking a little bit to potential sensitive periods, getting into this midlife phase of life course development, we found that shift and persist coping during the 30s was actually a protective factor and interacted with discrimination. The individuals who did high levels of shift and persist coping during their 30s didn't display the negative impact of depression on their depressive symptoms during that decade. We also found another finding specifically in this midlife period where discrimination that individuals faced during their 40s led to greater levels of depressive symptoms a full 10 years later when participants were in their 50s. So really a significant lagged effect. But again, we found that shift and persist coping was protective during midlife. And when individuals did high levels of shift and persist coping during their 40s, when they were facing that discrimination in the 40s didn't exert this influence on their depressive symptoms 10 years later. Kind of what were the key findings across this study? First, in line with a number of other studies and meta-analysis, great work in this area, discrimination exerts a harmful influence on mental health throughout the life course. And I think longitudinal examinations are really important to further kind of just understand this major cause of health disparities across the life course. Second, we found that with hypotheses, midlife is emerging as the sensitive period for discrimination and shift and persist coping. So this is kind of going along with the stress sensitization model and this idea from Mazur and Maciejewski that negative life events, such as discrimination, can lead to a particular and marked rise in depressive symptoms during midlife, even more so relative to other periods of adult development. This also goes back to kind of foundational thinkers and drivers of the field of psychology like Hall, who really saw midlife as this inflection period between growth and decline. And kind of how I make sense of these findings is midlife is a period where a lot of things should be going for people. We should be hitting these developmental milestones, be into our career, have a flourishing family life for many people. A lot of things are supposed to be figured out. But if we face discrimination during this period, discrimination can be a major disruptor of some of those life achievements and developmental milestones. So it makes sense to me why discrimination during this time period would be so predictive of individuals' depressive symptomatology. Finally, taking a step back, I think accelerated longitudinal design is a really underused but powerful tool to assess developmental processes in samples such as MIDAS, and really any samples where you have longitudinal data, but individuals of several different ages represented at each wave of data collection. Thinking kind of where do we go from here, just want to acknowledge again that the sample that I used in this study had a very low proportion of individuals from racial and ethnic minoritized backgrounds. The sampling weights did partially correct for that, but I think overall in the field, there's just a very, very great need for longitudinal data with these diverse samples. And that would allow us to pay attention to different forms of discrimination. We could look at things like racial ethnic discrimination and racism specifically. You could also do a better job of capturing some intersectional experiences of discrimination, things like at the intersection of race and gender identity, for example. Really interested in kind of following up this work to see if these findings generalize across outcomes. So is midlife this kind of sensitive period for discrimination and shift and persist coping only in the context of depression, or might it extend to other outcomes as well? Thirdly, I really think, and a lot of my work focuses on some of these more communal forms of coping that tend to be practiced by and reflect the values, traditions, and cultural practices of racially, ethnically minoritized groups. I'm really interested in kind of extending this work to looking at the longitudinal and life course implications of ways of coping, such as civic engagement and activism as a coping strategy, spiritually based coping, and coping with individual stressors at the family level. Finally, in terms of implications, I really see this identification of sensitive periods of development as useful because it can directly inform periods for targeted intervention. So if we know that discrimination exerts a particularly harmful influence in midlife, we can work to identify and then intervene upon protective factors such as shift and persist before we enter into those sensitive periods to better let individuals stay on healthy psychological trajectories across time. I just want to thank again the NIH OBSSR, this award, my co-author on this paper, Dr. Gabby Leva-Stein, all the institutions that trained me and continue to support my work, and thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Kristoff. First question, how can we increase BIPOC communities being invited to participate in research so findings can be more generalizable to the diverse population that is the US?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. I think it's a really difficult question. I think at the end of the day, a lot of these things take time, right? A lot of these populations are populations that historically haven't been treated well by some of these larger social systems. And I think working with them and gaining trust from different institutions takes time and it takes effort. And I think you have to be willing to invest in those communities, invest in those people without immediate expectations of returns in terms of research. So we can't just be using people to increase our N. We need to invest in them and not have the expectation that they will immediately want to invest in us and our work. So I think it just takes time, effort, and just being genuine with people.
Thank you. Another question is about shift and persist. Is that how you operationalize resilience? Is it a form of cognitive behavioral therapy? Is it psychodynamic or narrative therapy? This participant says it's definitely promising and would like to know more.
Yeah, so this term is coined by Edith Chen and Greg Miller around 2012, and it's really been most studied in kind of the health psychology field. They see it as really useful, especially in the context of physiological health, because if you have this understanding and are able to turn away, kind of shift away from stressors that are truly uncontrollable, that you couldn't change even if you tried your hardest, that will help kind of lead to better physiological responses to these uncontrollable stressors. So you have that kind of turning away if you're not able to actively change stress, and then finding other things that kind of fill your bucket in a way, finding this meaning and purpose and optimism. So I see it as definitely a cognitively based way of thinking that's relevant to different therapy modalities. I think a lot of people, when I present this work, have commented that there are kind of some ACT-like aspects to it of like values, consistent behavior. It doesn't necessarily come from those, but I can definitely see parallels between those things, both in the cognitive restructuring that comes from CBT and this value persistent behavior that is related to persist. Yeah.
Thank you. Did you have any findings that suggested childhood discrimination informing the midlife period?
So we didn't look at, and I don't think Midas necessarily, I might be incorrect here, has measures of kind of childhood retrospective accounts of discrimination. If it does, or if there are other data sets to do, I'd definitely be interested in looking at that. But in this study, we were really interested in these kind of decade by decade fluctuations in discrimination, and then kind of how those impacted, again, those peaks or valleys in depressive symptomatology.
Okay. Which level of coping resource, family, faith-based community, neighborhood, might be more salient to buffer the discrimination impacts on health?
Yeah, I think that we were talking about this before. I do think that these community level, these communal forms of coping are very important. I study mostly, almost exclusively racially and ethnically minoritized populations, and study mostly youth, but have studies on adults as well. I do think that these communal levels are really important. And I'm really interested, especially just given what we know about the positive impacts of kind of collectivism and family cultural values, interested in digging into a little bit more how individuals have these individual level stressors, right? They experience a stressor at work, a kid experiences a stressor at school, but that they take that home and that becomes the responsibility of like the family unit to resolve that. So I think those communal level, whether it's at the level of the family, at the level of a church group or a group, an activist group involved in different types of civic and political engagement, I do think that communal level is highly salient, and I think it's something that we don't necessarily measure as much.
Terrific. Thank you. That's all the time we have. Keita, thank you so much. There are some other questions, including where one can find the ESIs publications, and I will put that link in the chat shortly. That link also will take our viewers to our ESIs biographies, where they can find contact information for everyone. First, though, I need to introduce Dr. Patricia Homan, who's Assistant Professor of Sociology and Associate Director of the Public Health Program at Florida State University. She also is an associate of FSU's Pepper Institute on Aging and Public Policy and the Center for Demography on Population Health. Her research focuses on developing theory and measurement for structural sexism, structural racism, and other forms of structural injustice, and examining how these forces shape health. Dr. Homan's work has been published in the American Sociological Review, Demography, the American Journal of Public Health, Health Affairs, Social Forces, Social Science and Medicine, the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, Health Services Research, the Gerontologist, and the Journals of Gerontology Series B. Her research has won multiple awards, including the 2022 Early Career Gender Scholar Award from SWS South, the 2021 American Sociological Association Sex and Gender Sections Distinguished Article Award, and the 2019 Roberta G. Simmons Outstanding Dissertation Award from ASA's Medical Sociology section. Dr. Homan's presentation is Structural Intersectionality as a New Direction for Health Disparities Research. Dr. Homan, it's your turn to present. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So as Bill said, my research is focused on developing theory and measurement for structural sexism and other forms of structural injustice, and seeing how they relate to population health. The paper that I'm thrilled to share with you today is about integrating these structural approaches with intersectionality theory to move the field forward in a new direction. So the words racism and sexism often bring to mind overt behaviors such as sexual harassment, employment discrimination, hate speech, violence, or various other kinds of offensive or abusive behaviors carried out by individual bad actors. But these actions are not isolated incidents. In fact, they're widespread and systemic, and they're symptoms of underlying unjust power structures in a society. The current distribution of power, status, resources, rights, roles, opportunities, and exposures in American society is vastly unequal across race and gender groups. And this is what the concept of structural injustice or structural discrimination aims to capture: the drastic inequities embedded in our institutional arrangements. These inequities not only enable the type of interpersonal, direct racist and sexist mistreatment that can be so toxic, but they also have profound implications for the life chances, health, and well-being of all members of society, regardless of their awareness, and through a whole host of different mechanisms. And so this is why, in addition to measures that capture perceived discrimination, like the everyday discrimination scale, we also need measures that actually capture exposure to discriminatory systems, to oppressive social structures, to give us a more complete understanding of the health consequences of racism and sexism. Using an example from my structural sexism work, I'd like to quickly illustrate why structural measurement approaches are useful and how they can help get us beyond approaches that just use individual level categories as proxies for exposure to systemic inequalities. So this diagram represents a conventional approach where we might measure gender at an individual level, man, woman, and then examine the gender gap in the prevalence of some health outcome. And this type of research is vital and can tell us in an absolute sense who's healthy and who's not. The gender gaps are often used to then infer something about social inequality between men and women, but this can't necessarily tell us all we need to know about how discriminatory gender systems affect health, because there's a piece missing. We're not actually measuring structural sexism exposure. So for now, let's just assume that we're capturing the gap, the gender health gap, at the average level of exposure to sexism in an environment. But in theory, these dots could be anywhere along the x-axis. So you could have a gap between men and women Like this, in a scenario in which sexism has no effect on health and the gaps that we see are attributable to some other factor. Or you could have the very same gap in a situation in which sexism is universally harmful for both men and women. Everyone would be better off in a more gender egalitarian environment. Or sexism could be bad for women's health while men receive a health benefit. This type of pattern is what we might predict based on a traditional gender conflict approach, where we see oppressive social relations as a zero-sum game. Yet another scenario could be that women's health is harmed and men are both advantaged in some respects and disadvantaged in others, so that on the whole, sexism has no effect on men. The point is that any of these patterns of effects are possible with the same observed gender gap in health. We don't actually know how discriminatory systems are influencing health unless we find a way to measure exposure. So a structural sexism approach shifts the focus from comparisons between men and women to within gender comparisons across levels of exposure to discriminatory systems. So structural inequality approaches like this one allow us to examine how the unequal distribution of power, status, and resources in a society affects the health of all of its members, both dominant and subordinate groups. And there are several emerging lines of health disparities research that have been developing new ways to measure systems of oppression at a more macro level. So here are some examples, just focusing here on studies that measure structural inequalities at the US state level, but of course you can also measure them at other levels of geography. Most folks are probably familiar with a growing body of research that has measured structural racism in US state level institutions across a variety of domains and found that it's associated with things like myocardial infarction, infant mortality, poor self-rated health, high BMI, functional limitations, and depressive symptoms among Black people. Parallel to this is my own research on structural sexism, published in ASR in 2019, where I developed theory and measurement for structural sexism and find that living in a US state characterized by high levels of structural sexism is associated with worse self-rated health, physical functioning, and more chronic disease for both men and women. And then finally, there's also evidence that greater income inequality at the state level is associated with shorter life expectancy. So this type of research is expanding rapidly, but thus far, we have typically only measured a single type of structural inequality at one time. But we know from intersectionality theory that these forces don't operate in isolation. The core insight of intersectionality theory is the recognition that individuals' experiences are not shaped by a single status hierarchy, but instead by multiple overlapping systems of oppression. Racism, sexism, economic exploitation, and many more forms of oppression intersect to shape individuals' lives and health in complex ways. Over the past 15 years, there's been a growing body of intersectional research on population health. And this work has generated major contributions to our knowledge of health disparities by showing how health is jointly shaped by these interlocking systems, particularly of race, gender, and class stratification. For example, prior research has shown that racial ethnic inequalities in health are larger among women than men. And also the relationship between SES and health is racialized such that Black people receive diminished returns to socioeconomic resources compared to their white counterparts. But it is important to note that while intersectional health disparities research conceptually reflects systemic inequality, the measurement strategies have been focused on the individual level. So the vast majority of research in this area has examined individual level social status categories, race, gender, and class categories, such as Black woman or white man, as proxies for systems of exposure to racism, sexism, and economic exploitation. So we haven't actually measured these systems directly in intersectional health disparities research. So what we really need is a synthesis of structural and intersectional approaches to population health. So in the article that was selected for this award, co-authored by Tyson Brown and Brittany King, we advocate for the development of a structural intersectionality approach. A structural intersectionality approach to population health would begin with answering at least two key questions. First, how do systems of oppression vary and relate to one another at a macro level in time and space? Second, how do these structural inequalities jointly shape the health of various population groups defined by constellations of individual level statuses? As an early foray into this quantitative structural intersectionality and health research, in this article, we choose to focus on the three classic axes of inequality: race, gender, and class, but there's also sexuality, nativity, etc. So to answer the first question, we explore how measures of structural racism, sexism, and income inequality intersect in US state level environments. To our knowledge, no prior study measured all three of these key types of structural inequality in US states and examined how they relate to one another. To answer the second question, we combine state level inequality measures with individual level health and demographic data, and use multi-level models to investigate how the three types of structural inequality combine to shape the health of Black men, Black women, and white men. So here is a list of the measures that we used. We can't spend too much time on this, but the racism measures are based on previous research, and they come from another study co-authored with Tyson Brown. We have 9 indicators across 5 domains, and mostly they're Black-white ratio measures. So for example, the ratio of Black to white unemployment in a state or incarceration in a state. For the structural sexism measures, they come from the 2019 ASR study that I did, and I have 6 measures across 4 domains. And then for economic inequality, we went with the most commonly used measure in the health literature, which is simply the Gini coefficient, reflecting income inequality. And I should mention that the emphasis in this project is on combining existing measures of racism, sexism, and economic inequality from previous research into a structural intersectionality analysis, but not necessarily on developing new measures. So you'll notice that the racism and sexism measures are much more comprehensive than the economic inequality measure, because there just isn't yet a well-developed structural classism approach. So that represents a promising area for future research. So we have these measures for 2000 and 2010, the past 2 census years. And we asked the question, how are they related to one another across US states? Structural racism tends to be the highest in Midwestern and Northeastern states, consistent with prior studies showing that these regions have especially high levels of racial inequality in things like education and judicial domains. Structural sexism, however, is highest in the Southern and Rocky Mountain regions, while income inequality tends to be the highest along both coasts and in states with large populations and major cities. So New York, California, Florida, Texas. And when we look at the bivariate correlations, we find that there is surprisingly little overlap. Before seeing these correlations, we might have logically expected that the types of structural inequality would be positively correlated if, for example, certain contexts were characterized by an overall egalitarian ethos and commitment to inclusion. But in fact, we find that there are relatively weak to moderate negative correlations among structural sexism, racism, and income inequality. And this suggests that distinct processes are at work generating these systems of oppression, at least in terms of their manifestations in state level environments. To the extent that these systems are interdependent, it appears they work in opposition rather than in tandem. So next, we connected these state level measures of inequality to individual level data from the BRF-SS, and we linked them based on the individual person's state of residence at the time of the survey to capture their exposure to these intersecting inequalities. Our outcome is self-rated health, and we use multi-level models. And in order to simplify the range of possible structural intersections in the regression models, we dichotomized racism, sexism, and income inequality at the median. Thus, an individual person's exposures can be characterized as either below average on all 3 types of inequality, which is the reference category, above average on any single type, or in any other combination, for a total of 8 combinations. And we estimated separate models for each intersectional race, gender, individual level category. So here you can see our results showing how these structural inequalities combine to shape health of various population groups. The figure shows the predicted self-rated health values for each group in these contexts characterized by the different combinations of high and low levels of the 3 types of inequality. The red bands show the confidence interval around the all low estimate as a baseline, so we can see which combinations are significantly different from that and for whom. A key takeaway here is that Black women have the worst self-rated health and are the most affected by the various types of structural inequality, while white men tend to have better self-rated health than Black men and women and are unaffected by intersecting structural inequalities. Looking at the top panel, you can see that exposure to all 3 types of structural inequality alone and in most combinations is associated with worse health among Black women. So in conclusion, we find that structural inequalities they vary considerably across US states. They intersect in a variety of ways, but they do not strongly or positively co-vary. However, they do jointly shape health, and they do so differentially along race and gender lines. And they're most consistent with poor health among Black women. So our analysis here certainly isn't the final word, rather it's a first step, and it's intended to be illustrative of how a structural intersectionality approach can point us in a useful new direction. Looking to the future, there are so many things to explore. First, there are several ways we can broaden our inquiry by refining and expanding our existing measures of sexism, racism, and classism. But there's also many other forms of structural inequality that we need to investigate, including heterosexism, cissexism, ableism, nativism, ageism, and their intersections. There are also many more health outcomes we've yet to examine. Some other work that I'm doing is on biomarkers, life expectancy, and maternal child health. But also we can continue expanding our intersectional thinking by considering not just how structural measures intersect to shape health, as we've done here, but also how we might develop measures of structural inequality that are themselves intersectional. So for example, the concept of structural gendered racism, or Everett and colleagues' concept of structural heteropatriarchy, which combines sexism and heterosexism. And then finally, applying a life course lens and using longitudinal data also represent important areas for future research. So there's just a lot more exciting work to be done on building on this research. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to my co-authors and funders.
Thank you, Trish. Indeed, audience, do feel free to drop in your questions. Dr. Homan, when Dr. Crenshaw published her original article, and I think it was '89, she gives the example of people experiencing all these isms at once as they're crossing through the intersection and cars are coming at them, and perhaps they don't make it out alive, but if they, now I'm not quoting her, right? But those who make themselves across the intersection in one piece are affected in many ways. You pointed out the inequities. Are there any like shift and persist like qualities, echoing back to Keita, that come from making your way through the intersection in your work?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I'm not sure.
Okay, that's great.
The thing that actually most connected my work, I thought, to Dr. Kristoff's work is the idea of sensitive periods. We have not yet examined sensitive periods for exposure to structural inequalities, and I think that's a really fascinating direction that future research can go in for sure. Terrific.
Thank you. We have another question. How would you incorporate other minorities, for example, Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, Asian, into structural racism measures?
So I'm glad that someone asked that question. That is such an important question because all of the structural racism work that I've been doing and a lot of what I've been reading is mostly focused on Black-white racism in the US for certain historical and obvious reasons. But I think that developing a structural racism measure or approach that incorporates the Latinx community and the Asian communities could be really important for future research. And I haven't seen that yet in the literature. So I hope to see that soon.
Okay, next question, and I quote, "Great presentation. I'm trying to reconcile two unexpected findings. One, low structural racism in Jim Crow states, which aligns with other structural racism studies as well. And two, given that racism and sexism were adversely related, why did Black women do the worst?" This participant is wondering if it's because Black women have been largely excluded from advances in the women's movement that addressed structural racism, or what are your other thoughts in that regard?
Those are great questions. So first, on structural racism being low in Jim Crow states, a lot of people are surprised, I think, when they see that these particular state level racism measures are not super high in the South. And part of the reason we think that is happening is that these are not measures of like interpersonal or cultural racism per se. The South may have its own flavor of racism, but these are measures of systemic exclusion from institutions, so the labor market or home ownership. And the South has much larger populations, Black populations. So I think just from a practical standpoint, it's much harder to exclude large populations from major social institutions than it would be to exclude places where they're in smaller in numbers, if that makes sense. So they can sort of develop some political power and things like that. So I think it has a lot to do with the distribution of the population as well. And then related to Black women and white women and the fact that racism and sexism are weakly negatively associated, I think that has to do with this idea that perhaps the increased subordination of Black people may allow white women to advance in what's been called the racial division of paid reproductive labor. So I'm thinking of the work of Evelyn Nakano-Glenn. This idea that white women are able to move to more lucrative and higher status positions in the paid labor market because Black men and women are employed in lower paying backroom jobs, service occupations, or domestic labor that enables white women's advancement. So that's just a theory, but I think it's one that makes a lot of sense.
Indeed, thank you. We have more questions that we can get to if we have time at the end of all the presentations. But thank you, Dr. Homan. It's time for me to present Dr. John W. Jackson, Assistant Professor in the Departments of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Mental Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He's also core faculty in the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Equity and Center for Health Disparities Solutions. His research primarily focuses on developing methodological tools for translational health equity research. This includes methods to identify high leverage targets and strategies for interventions that address health disparities, as well as methods to evaluate interventions and translate them to new populations and contexts with current applications in healthcare and clinical prognosis. Dr. Jackson's work has been funded by a KO1 award from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, as well as pilot funding from Johns Hopkins. He serves on the editorial board at Epidemiology and also Sociological Methods and Research. His presentation is titled Meaningful Causal Decompositions in Health Equity Research. Dr. Jackson, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. And I, like many of us here, I'm very honored to be presenting in the memory of Dr. Matilda White Riley and to be sharing the stage with very exceptional and creative young scholars and also Dr. David Williams. So today, I'm going to be discussing my recent paper in Epidemiology, Meaningful Causal Decompositions in Health Equity Research, which is really discussing the need to incorporate both principles of causal inference as well as value judgments about health equity when we're seeking to identify contributing factors to health disparities. So to motivate the work, I'm going to use the example of hypertension control. These are data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey from the years from 1999 through 2016. On the left, you can see trends in prevalence over that time frame, with non-Hispanic Blacks in green, non-Hispanic whites in blue, and Hispanics in yellow. And what you see over that time frame is a large disparity in the prevalence of hypertension that's persisted over time, particularly between non-Hispanic Blacks and non-Hispanic whites. When we think about bringing hypertension under control once treated, which is shown on the right, we see two things. One is we see increases at the population level. So we've been able to increase the proportion of hypertension control by about 10%, but at the same time, we see that inequities in hypertension control have persisted. In particular, we have not closed the gap between Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites, and also the 10% gap between non-Hispanic Blacks and non-Hispanic whites has actually maintained itself over time. And this is a particularly striking state of affairs because hypertension is one area where we understand the epidemiology very well, and we have several tools at our disposal. So the American Heart Association has the theme of Life's Simple Seven, which emphasizes the non-pharmacological interventions that we have to lower blood pressure, including weight loss, maintaining a healthy diet, being physically active, all of which have meaningful effects on the ability to lower blood pressure. At the same time, the American College of Cardiology has very detailed clinical guidelines, several classes of medication with different mechanisms of action that can be stratified according to comorbidity and have effects that have been established in well-conducted large randomized controlled trials. And as many of my co-presenters have emphasized today, one of the reasons why these disparities persist is because the etiology is very complex, involving structural and contextual factors. And to reflect that, the state of the art for interventions that are addressing health inequities, particularly in healthcare, and particularly for hypertension, involve multiple modalities that address multiple targets that act at multiple levels of social organization. But the pressing question is we have to have some finite set of targets that these interventions are to address. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we actually go about selecting these targets using the data from observational studies? And so as as an epidemiologist, I tend to work with observational data. One thing that we can do to start to think about this is we can ask ourselves about a hypothetical thought experiment that we might be able to emulate from our observational data. And so in this experiment, we can think about the observed level of hypertension among the Black population, and similarly so for the white population. And then the difference between their average levels of hypertension would give us a measure of observed disparity. Then we could ask ourselves about a counterfactual. And in that counterfactual, we would intervene to change the distribution of an intervention target. And for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on an intervention target of treatment intensification. Now, the theory goes that disparities in treatment intensification can occur because of clinical uncertainty, which can be driven by inadequate relationships between patients and providers, particularly in inadequate communication, so that decisions may be driven more by implicit bias rather than clinical knowledge. But in thinking of treatment, and actually I want to point out that recently there's been some evidence of treatment intensification disparities, particularly in different settings. So this can be a very real intervention target. So with that as a target, we can think about a counterfactual. What would the level of hypertension control be for the Black population if we intervene to remove disparities in treatment intensification? And so if we contrast the observed level versus the counterfactual level of hypertension control, where the counterfactual again is under the scenario where we've removed disparities in treatment intensification, that gives us a sense of how much the disparity might change, how much the disparity in hypertension control would change if we could remove disparities in treatment intensification. And then if we compare that counterfactual scenario for Blacks to the observed scenario for whites, that gives us a sense of how much the disparity in hypertension control would persist if we could remove disparities in treatment intensification. But before we actually can emulate this, this thought experiment from the observational data, we have to step back and ask ourselves, what exactly do we mean by disparities? And this is important because we have two disparities in view. One pertains to our outcome, which is hypertension control. The other is with respect to our intervention target, which is treatment intensification. And so two of the prevailing definitions of disparity that have been used in the medical and public health literature are the Healthy People 2020 definition, which was put forth by Paula Braden and colleagues, which says that health disparities are systematic, plausibly avoidable health differences affecting socially disadvantaged groups. And there's the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academies of Medicine definition from 2002, 2003, which was used in the Unequal Treatment Report, which says that healthcare disparities are differences in healthcare that are not due to access-related factors, clinical needs, or preferences for care. And what these two definitions point out is that a racial difference is not necessarily the same as a racial disparity. In other words, a gap or an inequality may not necessarily be the same thing as what we mean by disparity. And so you can interpret these definitions as actually designating some differences that as not necessarily being unjust, that we could adjust for to remove or to take their contribution off the table when we measure disparity. And then likewise, we can think of non-allowable sources as sources that are unjust, that we would not want to adjust for to keep their contribution on the table when we measure disparity. So in thinking about disparities in our outcome, hypertension control, what should we have as allowable? What should we adjust for? We know that in clinical samples, the Black population is often younger, has a higher proportion of females, which would predict better hypertension control, all else equal. Excuse me. And we also know that in these samples, usually the Black population has a higher proportion or higher prevalence of comorbid conditions, and also lower socioeconomic status on average, which would predict worse hypertension control. So in the paper, I discuss a couple principles. It's not an exhaustive list, but a couple principles to think about how you choose which covariates should be allowable or non-allowable. And the principle that I think is most relevant for thinking about allowability in the outcome disparity is this principle of amenability to intervention, which simply says that non-manipulable factors that have addressable effects are non-allowable, i.e. should not be adjusted for if they adversely affect the socially marginalized group. So you can think that if Blacks are disadvantaged with respect to hypertension control, those differences are part of the disparity. And they're part of the disparity because we have ways to address their effects. And if we don't do this equitably, then that can be considered unjust. So in this example, this would mean treating clinical factors, pre-existing conditions, and markers of socioeconomic status as non-allowable and not adjusting for them so that they're included in disparity, but treating age and sex as allowable and adjusting for them so that they do not attenuate disparity. In thinking about our intervention target, which is treatment intensification, what should be allowable? What should we adjust for? We know that treatment differences across race could arise in many different ways, either from differences in demographics, clinical status, socioeconomic status. In this example, I think the principle that's most useful is the idea of an ideal social contract, which is simply an aspirational proposal that an analyst could put forward to say, these are criteria that should guide how our target is distributed in a way that would lead us to a more equitable and just society. So in this example, the application is really straightforward because we have arguably well-developed clinical guidelines, particularly from the American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association, that base treatment decisions on physiological and biologically prognostic factors, not on socioeconomic status or stigmatized criteria. So this would call for treating age and sex or demographics and clinical factors and pre-existing conditions and blood pressure as allowable for the purpose of defining the intervention on treatment disparities. So putting these ideas together gives us a really more precise thought experiment. How do disparities in hypertension control standardized for demographics, age, and sex change upon equalizing treatment intensification within levels of demographics and clinical factors? So in essence, in this thought experiment, we can allow for racial differences in treatment intensification, just not when we look at people who have the same levels or same values for demographic factors and also clinical factors. Key point here is that only demographics are used to define the disparity in hypertension control. So we're going to call those outcome allowable covariates. So demographics are outcome allowable because they're defining disparities in our outcome, hypertension control. I'm going to denote those as AY. And then second, only demographics and clinical factors are used to define the intervention on the disparity and treatment intensification, which is treatment intensification is denoted as M. And those factors together are called target allowable. So just notationally, we've already labeled demographics as outcome allowable. So we're going to call clinical factors as AM to reflect the fact that they're target allowable, but not outcome allowable. But together, demographics and clinical factors are both target allowable. And then finally, another key point is that socioeconomic status is never used to define the disparity either in the outcome or in the target that we wish to remove. And so they're non-allowable, going to denote those as N. And I want to emphasize that the disparity measures and concepts that we're working here are really descriptive comparisons of racial groups who are similarly situated on the allowables in a distributional sense. It's not a causal effect of intervening on race. It's not a causal effect of intervening on the allowables. And it's not a causal effect of intervening on the non-allowables. The only causal inference that's going on in our thought experiment is asking what happens when we shift the distribution of treatment intensification. So all the causal inference is really going around treatment intensification. And so to emulate this thought experiment from observational data, we can essentially rely on fairly standard assumptions that are used in the causal inference literature. So if you're familiar with propensity scores or inverse probability weighting, they're very similar assumptions. They are in some ways subtly weaker, which I'll leave for the paper if you wish to read. But the one that I really want to point out here is no unmeasured confounding for the effect of treatment intensification on hypertension control, given the covariates, which includes the allowables, which would be demographics, clinical factors, and also the non-allowables, which would be socioeconomic status, or any other variable that's not used to define our disparities or our intervention that we would need to adjust for confounding. And again, we also have some overlap assumptions, some positivity and consistency assumptions, which we can get to in the questions, or you can read more about in the paper. So if those assumptions hold, we actually can estimate both our observed reduced and also our residual disparities. To estimate the observed disparity, we can take a difference in weighted means, comparing the Black versus white populations, where for the Black population, it's a stabilized inverse probability weight reflecting the inverse probability of being Black given the outcome allowable. So this is adjusting for demographics, age, and sex. Similarly, for the white population, it's a stabilized inverse probability weight reflecting the probability of being white given the outcome allowables, which again are demographics, age, and sex. And in each case, the denominators of the weights can be estimated from a model for racial group membership given the allowables. And again, the purpose here is just to identify this observed disparity that's standardized for demographics. Now, for the reduced disparity, we again take a difference in weighted means, but this time across the Black population, but using two different weights. The first weight is that stabilized inverse probability weight reflecting the inverse probability of being Black given the demographics that I just discussed. The second weight takes that initial stabilized inverse probability weight and multiplies it by a second factor. It's a ratio of two probabilities, and on the numerator and the denominator, it's reflecting the probability of having one's observed level of treatment intensification. But there are two differences. The first difference is that in the denominator, the probability is defined by the Black population. In the numerator, it's defined by the white population. And the second difference is what is conditioned on. In both cases, we condition on all the allowables, all the allowable covariates. So that would be demographics, age, and sex. But in the denominator, we're also conditioning on the non-allowable covariates. And so what this weight actually accomplishes is it takes the Black population and takes their observed distribution of treatment intensification and replaces it with this distribution of treatment intensification that's defined among the white population, but doesn't condition on the non-allowables. And in doing so, it allows for us to emulate the hypothetical scenario where we remove disparities in treatment intensification and then ask about how that reflects in terms of its impact on the disparity in hypertension control. And again, these weights can be estimated by using the predicted values of models. So one thing that's really cool about the paper is it can be shown that many existing estimators across many literatures, social science literature, the epidemiology literature, economics, demography, many of these estimators that are used to explain disparity or to identify targets to reduce disparity make automatic judgments about allowability. So in our case, one approach that's actually been more used in recent years is causal mediation analysis, i.e. natural direct and indirect effects. If you look at those estimators and you apply them, they in this case, in this example, they would over adjust the disparity measure by adjusting for clinical factors, socioeconomic status. And we said that we wouldn't want to adjust for those because if we did, we would violate the principle of amenability to intervention. Blacks are disadvantaged on those factors. We have ways to address them. Therefore, they should be included as part of disparity. It also causal mediation analysis would employ an inequitable equalization because it will remove racial differences in treatment intensification within levels of socioeconomic status. And so if you think it through, what that means is that if there are any racial differences in treatment intensification that occur through racial differences in socioeconomic status, those are going to be still present in our thought experiment. And so it's an inequitable intervention. So the real takeaway from the paper is that the analysis should incorporate one's value judgments. And we should always do that by beginning with a clear definition of what we mean by disparity or inequity, not necessarily being the same thing as an inequality. And we have to really closely look at these off-the-shelf estimators that are very convenient to use, but really see if they align with our value judgments. And it's important, not just for theoretical exercise, but our results are meant to inform interventions, and the interventions are necessarily going to have to abide by certain equity value judgments. And if that's not the case, you can consider a more flexible approach that can be tailored to align with your value judgments. So you could use the approaches in the paper. There are other estimators besides the weighting ones that can be used. And in fact, that's some of the things that I'm working on right now, more robust estimation approaches, other ways of estimating these decompositions, expanding them for longitudinal survival data, et cetera. Also working on simulation studies, also more formal theoretical underpinnings of the ways that disparity is defined here, and also thinking about what the impact of this work is for how we evaluate the effects of interventions and policies on making progress in disparity, which I think is critically important. And then finally, I'm very much interested in translation and dissemination with empirical examples, including electronic medical records and providing software. So I want to just take a quick moment to thank a few people. I've had a lot of mentors, so it's always dangerous to start naming names, but Dr. Lisa Cooper and Elizabeth Stewart really been supportive of me in my career award. I also want to give a shout out to Dr. David Williams for encouraging me to pursue my passion in health equity when I was a postdoc. I would like to thank the NHLBI for funding my career award, and also the Johns Hopkins Centers for Health Equity and Health and Center for Health Disparities Solutions for nurturing me, for challenging me, and really teaching me what it means to pursue health equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. We're a bit over time, so I hope perhaps at the end we'll have the opportunity to bring up some questions related to your really thorough, exciting presentation. First, though, it's my job to introduce Dr. Alina Palamaru, Associate Policy Researcher at RAND. Trained as a health services researcher, she has academic and firsthand practical experience in both quantitative and qualitative methods. For example, psychometrics, interview, and focus group methods. Much of her prior work identified disparities in health outcomes among vulnerable populations, including adults with physical disabilities, mental health and substance abuse problems, as well as adults with multi-morbidity experiencing homelessness. Findings from her studies have been used by clients including the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health and regional health plans to modify their provision of services to underserved populations. Dr. Palamaru also has experience working with data related to American Indian and Alaska Native youth in the context of sleep health, substance use prevention, and the social determinants of health. And that leads me to turn things over to Dr. Palamaru to present mental health, family functioning, and sleep in cultural context among American Indian and Alaska Native urban youth, a mixed methods analysis. Alina, I leave it to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elwood, for that very kind introduction. And I also want to join my prior panelists in congratulating really everybody on the panel for some really fascinating presentations and very important work in this area. I feel truly honored to present with them today. As you mentioned, the focus of the presentation today is mental health, family functioning, and sleep in cultural health context in American Indian, Alaska Native urban youth. And it is a mixed method study. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors who have been extremely supportive throughout. Now, I'm aware I'm last in the queue, so I hope you have that little bit of energy left for this presentation, and I will try to make it as engaging as possible. I suppose a good place to start is the set of problems that motivated this particular study. So we know that half of all mental health conditions begin in adolescence, and data show that compared to other groups, American Indian and Alaska Native youth experience high rates of mental health problems, experience with depression, anxiety, suicide rates are 1.5 times higher than the national average. Past research also indicates that insufficient sleep is a core driver of adolescent mental health. And this has very serious health and social consequences. And likewise, social factors such as family functioning have been linked to adolescent mental health. What's more, living in an urban context may increase risk of sleep and mental health problems in Native American youth. And this is due to certain characteristics that are more typical of urban areas, such as concentrations of poverty, low social capital, noise, and other features. 70% of Native Americans live off tribal lands, and 8% of Native American adolescents living off tribal lands reported a past year major depressive episode with severe impairment. And this is compared to 5.5% among adolescents on tribal lands. So those are the problems based on prior evidence. What are some of the gaps that we have identified? Excuse me, just having some advancing problems. So what are the problems that we have identified based on this evidence? So first, despite the high rates that were documented for mental health problems among Native American youths, there has been little exploration of the role of family functioning and sleep in mental health in this group. Second, in general, there is limited data on the role of cultural identity in mental health in American Indian Alaska Native youth. We know from prior anthropological explorations from other cultures that culture can play an important protective function for sleep and mental health. So it's important to understand it in the context of urban American, Native American communities too, especially given the documented experience of historical trauma that has caused significant social and cultural disruption. So on the basis of these gaps, these are the research questions that drove our investigation. First, we wanted to know what is the role of family functioning in mental health among Native American youths? Next, how does sleep relate to family functioning and mental health? And finally, how does cultural identity contribute to these associations? And to answer these questions, we used a mixed methods approach, which combined in-depth interviews with survey data to facilitate a deeper understanding of contextual and individual level factors. And I'll describe the approach in more detail shortly, but first I want to provide an overview of the sample that we used for the study. So we used data from the Native American Youth Sleep Health and Wellness Study, or NASHA. And this parent study has a sample of urban dwelling American Indian Alaska Native youths in northern, central, and southern California. They were aged 12 to 16 with a mean of 14. And the full sample consisted of 142 survey respondents, from which we randomly selected a subsample of 26 to be interviewed in depth. So let's take a closer look now at our mixed methods approach. This comprised 3 methodological stages, which included complementary and expansion methods. In stage 1, we examined the family cohesion and family conflict themes across our 26 interviews, and we specifically identified the instances that mentioned connections with sleep quality, sleep environment, and sleep behavior. Next, we compared the themes with the matching descriptive survey data. So this is known as the complementary approach. For example, the family cohesion narratives, we looked at those, and then we looked at the survey responses from the family cohesion scales that we used in the survey. And then we examined the themes for explicit and implicit meanings to generate hypotheses for the quantitative analyses. For example, we looked at how narratives described cultural practice in relation to family functioning and or sleep. And these steps set us up for our quantitative analyses, which use a number of measures for family cohesion and conflict, for sleep disturbance, which we measured both objectively through wrist-worn actigraphy and subjectively through self-reported measures. We also looked at mental health, depression and anxiety, and cultural identity, which we measured using the multi-group ethnic identity measure with items such as, I have a clear sense of my AIAN identity and what it means to me. And I want to note that all the models controlled for sex, age, and family structure, where we looked at single versus 2-parent household. So let's start a review of our results, and we'll begin with the qualitative results. Here we had 2 main themes of family functioning from the interviews, each with several dimensions. The first one was family cohesion. So this looked at how the teens perceived that they bonded with their families. First, they mentioned bonding through daily family interactions, and this was mentioned by over 60% of interviewees, and it's illustrated by this quote. When my grandma is here, I like to chill with her. I like to talk to her, and I'll play games. The second type of family bonding was family storytelling about Native heritage, which half of the qualitative sample mentioned. For instance, this 14-year-old male said, I try to know some things about my heritage. I would ask my mom on a daily basis sometimes. Other examples from the narratives of family bonding mentioned attending powwows and other events on reservations. And the third aspect of cohesion was engaging with the extended family. Almost 40% of the subsample talked about this. And we know that in urban Native American communities, the extended family, for example, aunts, uncles, tribal elders, plays a very important function of support. In the context of this study, this type of support materialized itself through cohabiting on a temporary or permanent basis with relatives. In some instances, this form of support is perceived to be a source of comfort, as this young female said. I had my grandma staying with us, so she was in the same room with me. I felt really happy. It felt more complete in a way. But in other cases, it can have negative consequences for sleep, as this young female participant explained. My nephew used to live with us, and he would cry a lot because he was a baby. When he started teething, that's when I would mainly stay awake. And I want to add that the narrative findings on cohesion align with the survey data from the cohesion scale. For example, 43% of survey respondents said that they spent a lot of time doing things together with their family. 65% said that their family has a lot of feeling of togetherness, and 40% of youth spent time trying to find out about their Native identity. The second theme of family functioning was focused on family conflict with 2 dimensions. More than a third of youth spoke about disagreements with family members, which sometimes affected sleep, as described here. I remember I got in a fight with my mom and I couldn't sleep the night, not until like 2 a.m. I was just really sad and angry. The second dimension was parental divorce, mentioned by about a fifth of interviewees. And this quote walks us through possible implications for sleep. We moved a lot. There were times where I would get sent to a family member's house because my mom had to work and my dad left. There were always random periods where my dad didn't want to talk to me. He didn't reach out because he was just too busy, and I understand. And likewise, with the family cohesion themes, the family conflict things were consistent with survey responses to items on the family conflict scale. So only 5% of respondents said that their family argues a lot. Only 4% said that in their family, they are mad at each other a lot. And also 46% of respondents lived in a single parent household. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we considered our narrative findings. So in stage 2, our analysis resulted in a set of hypotheses that we tested. So the family cohesion themes, for example, being comforted by the presence of family members, led us to hypothesize that greater family cohesion would be associated with lower depressive and anxiety symptoms. And similarly, given our findings on family conflict, for example, the expressions of sadness and anger following family argument, we hypothesized that greater family conflict would be associated with higher depressive or anxiety symptoms. Also, based on the literature that linked family dynamics with sleep, we also hypothesized that these associations would be mediated by lower self-reported sleep disturbance, greater sleep duration, and higher sleep efficiency. So in our analysis, we did find that higher levels of family cohesion were associated with lower levels of depression, and there was a significant indirect effect via the lower levels of subjective sleep disturbance. So in other words, greater family cohesion was associated with lower levels of sleep disturbance, which in turn was associated with lower levels of depressive symptoms. And the results are similar for the anxiety symptoms, so we're not showing them here. When we look at the results for family conflict, greater levels of family conflict were associated with higher levels of depressive symptoms. And there was, again, a significant indirect effect via higher levels of sleep disturbance. So in other words, greater family conflict was associated with higher levels of sleep disturbance, which in turn was associated with higher levels of depressive symptoms. Now, earlier I mentioned that we included objective measures of sleep in our analysis. There was no evidence of indirect effects from either family cohesion or conflict to depression or anxiety through those objective measures. And finally, based on the narratives that described family participation in cultural practices, and also based on the literature today showing the protective effects of culture in Native American populations, we hypothesized that cultural identity might buffer the effects of family functioning on sleep, but we did not find that the cultural identity moderated these associations of family conflict or cohesion, sleep disturbance, and depressive and anxiety symptoms. So what do these findings mean in a nutshell? So our narratives showed that traditional practices support family cohesion, and they also show that greater family cohesion contributes to healthy sleep. And this is consistent with findings elsewhere that indicated the connection and community are an important protective factor to increase resilience given historical trauma, but also to reduce the negative impacts of intergenerational trauma. The quantitative findings showed that better family functioning was directly linked with less depression and anxiety, and it had indirect effects through lower sleep disturbance. And we found, unlike prior research, that cultural identity in this case was not a significant moderator. So in conclusion, this study provides a closer look at the pathway between family functioning and mental health among Native American adolescents who live in urban area. And we have explored how sleep and cultural context contribute to these associations. However, we still need to understand the role of cultural identity in the association between family functioning and sleep. So other research found evidence that cultural identity matters when it comes to sleep and health, but we need to explore this further. One limitation that we report in our study may be that the cultural identity scale that we used had been developed for adults, and so it may not capture dimensions that are more salient to adolescents in urban areas. Nonetheless, these findings present several implications for practice. First, they suggest that we should tailor family-level interventions to balance kinship and family ties with potential constraints of sleeping environment. Second, given the role of family functioning in mental health, the interventions should address sleep health at family level. And finally, our work reinforces the need to expand community-based participatory research. In this study, we actively engaged members of the community at key steps of the research process. For example, when we designed the interview protocols, we wanted to make sure that our recruitment was culturally appropriate. We wanted to ensure that the results of our work was adequately disseminated through the community. And this is especially important when working with underrepresented communities that have faced historic abuses in the name of research. The findings also highlight potential future directions for research. As I mentioned earlier, our results around cultural identity underscore the need to continue to explore this concept in order to refine and evaluate it psychometrically, and also to strengthen family cohesion and resilience. Currently, I'm leading an NIH supplement that is looking at experiences of discrimination and the perceived role of cultural identity in coping with these experiences, and that work is ongoing. And finally, there are additional pressing research questions that I'm interested in pursuing relating to, for example, sleep, health, and disparities and housing. So these investigations would look at the legacy of historic and contemporary structural sources of discrimination and racism. We know, for example, that housing insecurity or instability is a significant problem among low-income populations in general, and it has in fact worsened during the pandemic. So it was manifesting itself through multiple relocations, stress about paying rent, being evicted. So we need to understand how to mitigate these factors with specific populations. And we also know that low-income individuals and families are likely to live in substandard housing environments, for example, mobile homes, homes with various exposures that can affect sleep and health, homes in noisy neighborhoods. So we need, again, to understand more how these features affect sleep in certain minority groups. And before I wrap up, I would like to acknowledge that this work was funded by a grant from the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, led by Doctors Wendy Troxel, Elizabeth D'Amico, and Dan Dickerson. And I'm very grateful to them for allowing me to work on this study with them and for supporting me throughout. And would also like to acknowledge my colleagues from the Survey Research Group and the support at RAND. And very importantly, our community partners and the project participants who have volunteered their time and their experiences.
Thank you, Dr. Palamaru. We had a really telling comment that anytime with family elders, there's always storytelling. It's an integral part of life and one's relationship with family. We do have time for a 5-minute break. And
I think you're muted, Bill.
Thank you. I will quote Kimberly Whitaker, who said, "Thank you for your presentation depicting the family interactions. Awesome work." We have time for a quick 5-minute break. So thank you, Dr. Palamaru. Congratulations to you and your colleagues. And we will start again at 3 p.m. when my colleague, Dr. Erica L. Spots, will begin the portion for our distinguished lecturer. Thank you all. Meet you back here.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erica Spots from OBSSR. I'm also the chair of the Matilda White Riley Distinguished Lecture Selection Committee. Welcome to the 15th Matilda White Riley Distinguished Lecture. The recipient of this award has a research career that has advanced behavioral and social scientific knowledge in areas within NIH's mission. The criteria for this award follow Dr. White Riley's vision through an expanded conceptualization of health and well-being that includes cognitive, affective, and social functioning, behavioral social science research results that improve the lives of people in society, illuminating the complex and dynamic interplay among processes at multiple levels, influence of social and behavioral factors on physical health and the utility of this knowledge for clinical practice and health policy, life course perspectives on development, health, and the well-being of individuals and societies, and research approaches that build theory and methods in the advancement of knowledge on health and well-being. The NIH community nominates researchers for this award, and the recipient is then selected by a committee that I will thank now. That committee includes Elizabeth Barr, Valerie Mahomes, April O, Mariella Shirley, and Michael Sturrett. This committee volunteers their time and effort to reading all the nominations and then selecting one from among many deserving nominees. I'd like to thank this year's committee for their service, and if we were in person, we'd give them a round of applause. I'm fairly sure that this year's awardee needs little, if any, introduction. It is with great pleasure that I present to you this year's Matilda White Riley lecturer, Dr. David R. Williams. Dr. Williams is the Norman Professor of Public Health and the chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. He is also a professor of African and African American Studies and Sociology at Harvard. He is the author of more than 500 scientific papers. His research has addressed how race, stress, socioeconomic status, racism, health behavior, and religious involvement can affect health. The everyday discrimination scale that he developed is the most widely used measure of discrimination in health studies. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the National Academy of Sciences. He has been ranked as the most cited Black scholar in the social sciences and as one of the world's most influential scientific minds. His research has been featured in the national print and television media and in his TED Talk. Following Dr. Williams's talk, we will have a Q&A session. You can enter your questions at any time in the chat box below. If we were in person, I would now ask Dr. Williams to come to the podium to receive his award. We present a I don't want to say a plaque, it's kind of a statue type thing. Since we're in a virtual forum, please know that we will send his award to him as soon as possible. It might even be there today. Rather than continue to take up precious time, I am more than happy to turn the stage over to Dr. Williams to begin his presentation. Please go ahead.
Thank you so very much. It's truly an honor to be here. As I looked at the list of the prior awardees, I'm deeply humbled by the honor that I received today. And I am so inspired by all of the scholars who presented before me. I am just energized by the innovative work that they're doing, and I look forward to really following their work and great things from them. I have a special spot in my heart for John Jackson because he worked with me some as a postdoctoral fellow here at the Chance School, and I have always had very high expectations for him. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my talk, and I will really begin on my talk. I want to talk about racism and the multiple ways in which it operates within society and has profound consequences for health. And I am doing something of a biographical, in part, of my own development of work in the area of racism. There are large racial ethnic differences in health in the United States and around the world. Many Americans think this is a US phenomenon, but no, it is in fact a global phenomenon. So I'll illustrate racial ethnic differences in health by showing that they really begin very early in life. Here are data on infant mortality in the United States by race and ethnicity, and you could see the markedly elevated risks for African Americans or Blacks, I'll use those terms interchangeably, or American Indians and Native Americans compared to the white population. If we look at data for the United Kingdom, we see a similar pattern with the Black populations, African Black and Caribbean Black, and the Pakistani population having markedly elevated rates of infant mortality compared to the white British population. If we look at data from Latin America, we can see that the Afro-descendant population, as persons of African ancestry, have higher rates of infant mortality in Costa Rica, in Panama, in Uruguay, in Venezuela, in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Colombia. So across a broad range of countries, we see this pattern. If we look again in Latin America, across the indigenous population compared to the non-indigenous, and you see a striking pattern in Costa Rica, Uruguay, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Guatemala, Bolivia. The indigenous population has higher rates of infant mortality. One more example, this time looking at the indigenous populations across multiple advanced societies, looking at the Maori in New Zealand, the Aboriginals in Australia, First Nations in Canada, and Native Americans served by the Indian Health Service in the United States. And you could see these are just the data on men. The data for women tell a similar story. In New Zealand, in Canada, in the United States, indigenous men have life expectancy that is 7 years shorter than that of the non-indigenous. And in Australia, it's 3 times larger. So the point I'm making across multiple contexts for multiple outcomes, we've really shown only 2, but we see this striking pattern of race mattering profoundly for health. So what drives these large racial inequities in health? Why do they exist in the first time? And as I thinking of causal factors, I was influenced by the work of sociologist Stanley Lieberson. In 1985, he published a book helping us to think through conceptual issues around methodology. And an important distinction that he made is when we think of causes, we should distinguish between basic or fundamental causes. Those are factors that are responsible for generating an outcome. And if we change those factors, they will change in the outcome. In contrast to surface or intermediate causes. Surface causes are factors that are related to the outcome, but if you change the surface causes, they will not produce corresponding change in the outcome. And he argued that it's for any social phenomenon, any phenomenon we're looking at, it is really important to make sure that we are clear on whether the factors, the predictors, the risk factors we're looking at are basic or fundamental causes, or simply surface or intermediate causes. And so my dissertation at the University of Michigan focused on socioeconomic inequalities in health. And in a paper published reviewing some of the conceptual issues I raised in my dissertation, I argued in 1990 that socioeconomic status was in fact a fundamental cause of racial inequities in health, and that across societies we see the power of socioeconomic status, whether measured by income, education, occupational status, or health, really predicting variations in health, and that the elimination of inequities in health would require change in underlying socioeconomic conditions. Jim House has also published work on SES as a fundamental cause, and Lincoln Phelan in a 1995 paper and in subsequent work have provided considerable evidence in support of socioeconomic status as a fundamental cause. Well, that makes sense to help us to shed some light on racial inequities in health, because in almost every society, race is strongly related to socioeconomic status. I begin with an example of national data for South Africa in terms of household income. And I'm presenting it in a way that's easy to follow, standardizing on the household income of whites in South Africa as 1 rand. Rand is the unit of currency. And for every rand of household income that white households receive in South Africa, Indian or Asian households receive 60 cents, colored households 40 cents, and black households 20 cents. Importantly, this gradation in income reflects the gradation and hierarchy of racial groups under the apartheid system, where whites were at the top, then came Indians, then came coloreds, and then came blacks. And this is the latest South Africa census data for 2014-2015. We see that pattern evident in household income. If we look at national data for the United States, median household income by race for 2018, and I'm standardizing on the household income of whites as $1. We see that Asian households have $1.23. Asian households are heavily made up of immigrants who have come to the United States with markedly high levels of education, markedly higher levels of education the Asian population has compared to the white population. But also importantly, to make sense of these data, Asian households have more persons contributing to household income. So if we were using a per capita measure of income, whites would have the highest. But because Asian households are more likely to be multi-generational and to have more persons contributing to household income, we see the pattern that we observe. But if we look at the historically disadvantaged groups, for every dollar of household income white households receive, Hispanic or Latino households receive 73 cents, and Native American and African American households receive 59 cents. What is stunning about the 59 cents figure for blacks in 2018 is that it's identical to the black-white gap in income in 1978. 1978 was a peak year of the narrowing of the black-white gap in income as a result of the civil rights policies and the anti-poverty policies of the 60s and 70s. And so when it comes to reducing racial inequity in income, we have been on a treadmill. There's been a lot of talk about progress and dismantling of racism, but on many indicators, with income being one of them, there has in fact been little progress. Much less progress than most Americans think, much less progress than most of my students think. We've been on a treadmill when it comes to reducing the income gap. And as large as these gaps show by income, they markedly understate the racial gap in economic status. And what do I mean by that? Well, income captures the flow of resources into the household, the salary, the wages, but it doesn't tell us anything about the economic reserves that households have to cushion shortfalls of income. We get that from data on wealth. And for every dollar of wealth that white households have, according to the Federal Reserve Board, black households have 10 pennies and Latino households have 12 pennies. So there are these very large racial differences in wealth. And again, to give one other example from another country, here's data for the United Kingdom. For every pound of wealth that the white British have, Indian have 95 pence, Pakistanis 50 pence, blacks from the Caribbean 20 pence, blacks from Africa and Bangladeshis 10 pence. So again, in another society, we see a similar stratification by both income. I'm not showing you the income data for the UK, but there is a similar stratification for income, but also by wealth. And what these data tell us is that when groups are low in socioeconomic status, low in income, and low in wealth, we all may be in the same storm of the pandemic, but we are in different boats. And some boats, because of the economic resources they have access to, are much better able to weather the storms. And when my career started, most researchers thought that given the power of socioeconomic status, that if we compared persons of different racial groups at the same level of income or education, for example, race would no longer matter. But now we know that there is an added burden of race. And I elaborated on this in an annual review of sociology paper in 1995 with Dr. Chiquita Collins, where we showed that racial differences in health persist even after we've taken income and education into account. And so it was really telling us that there is something else about race that matters even after we've taken socioeconomic status into account. And I just want to illustrate that by a paper I published with other colleagues back in 2010, where we looked at national data for the United States, life expectancy at age 25 by income and education. I'm going to show you the education data only in the interest of time. And what we found is that at age 25, there's a 5-year gap in life expectancy. The average white person will live 5 years longer than the average African American. However, if we look within race by education, there's a 6.4-year gap between whites who have a college degree or more education and whites who have not finished high school. Importantly, the socioeconomic gap is larger than the racial ethnic gap, and that is also true for African Americans. The difference between the highest and the lowest education groups are larger than the overall racial gap. So should we just focus on SES and not look at race? We would say not so fast, because at every level of education and also for income, race still matters. So whites who have not finished high school live 3.1 years longer than African Americans who have not finished high school, and the gap widens as education increases. This is stunning data, national data for the United States. The best of African Americans, those with a college degree or more education, have lower life expectancy than whites with a college degree, lower life expectancy than whites with some college, lower life expectancy than whites who have finished high school. So what do these data tell us? There is something profound about income and education that matters for your health, but there's something else about race that matters for your health. And so in this 1997 paper, I argued that racism was in fact a fundamental cause of racial inequities in health, and that in addition to socioeconomic status, we needed to pay more attention to racism. And here in this 77 paper, I had this framework for understanding the role of race and health, where I saw racism as a basic or fundamental cause, similar to the economic and political structures of society, with racism actually even shaping what race is, and that racism, in fact, was a driver of the socioeconomic inequities that we saw, along with other large-scale societal forces. And so I want to talk briefly about the house that racism built and the ways in which racism plays out to profoundly affect the distribution of desirable resources in society and also access to health. Importantly, I view racism as primarily a societal system, one that categorizes and ranks, devalues and disempowers. It's premised on the ideology of inferiority, and based on groups regarded as inferior or superior, it differentially allocates opportunities and resources. Yes, it can lead to the development of negative attitudes, prejudice and stereotypes to outgroups, and differential treatment by both individuals and institutions. But fundamentally, racism is a system. and I have tried to strengthen and develop the research in the area of racism and helping researchers to unpack the multiple ways in which racism and health. So in the mid-1990s, I approached Richard Cooper, who was the editor of the journal Ethnicity and Disease, and asked him if he would allow me to edit a special issue of that journal on racism and health. We had a special call for papers, and we got so many papers that we made it a double issue, 14 papers from scholars from multiple disciplines. To the best of my knowledge, it was the first ever special issue of a journal focused exclusively on the topic of racism and, in fact, health. So what do we know about racism and health? What is the evidence? We think of racism functioning through multiple mechanisms. And first, I want to talk about structural or institutional. These terms have somewhat changed over time. Institutional was the early word used by Carmichael and Hamilton or by James Jones in their early work. And I think what they use as institutional is today called more broadly structural or systemic racism, but they define the term institutional to capture anything that wasn't measured at the individual level. So I think between the 60s and the next 20 or so years, the institution was used a little differently than it's used today. So back in 2001, I published a paper again with Dr. Chiquita Collins where we argued that racial residential segregation was a fundamental cause of racial disparities in health. And what we meant by that is that if it is a fundamental cause, then efforts to address inequities that don't fundamentally dismantle the systems of racism are doomed to failure. We were not the first to talk about the centrality of segregation. John Sell was a historian at Duke University who wrote a book about the origins of segregation in the US South and South Africa. And importantly, he argued that residential segregation was one of the single most successful domestic policies of the 20th century in the United States. And someone says, well, how does segregation drive health? Well, think with me of segregation as a burglar at midnight. And once it enters a community, valuables disappear, like quality schools and safe playgrounds and good jobs and a healthy environment and safe housing and access to good transportation and access to high quality medical care. All of these factors, all of these wonderful resources vary by place in the United States. Two of my colleagues at Harvard, two of America's eminent sociologists, William Julius Wilson and Robert Sampson, studied the 171 largest cities in the US and said because of segregation, it's not even one city where whites live in equal conditions to those of blacks, and the worst urban context in which whites reside is considerably better than the average context of black communities. So segregation is producing inequities. And Professor Dolores Azevedo Garcia of Brandeis University has developed a neighborhood opportunity index, which ranks every county in the United States on 29 different indicators of access to opportunity for kids, things like the quality of schools and access to high-skilled jobs and the unemployment rate and the quality of the air, water, resources for green space and healthy food outlets, 29 different indicators. These are some of them. And what she's able to show, that if we look at the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, and we ask which of America's children live in neighborhoods characterized by very low and low opportunity, we find that 2 out of every 3 black children, 67%, 58% of Latino kids, 53% of Native American kids live in low opportunity neighborhoods, compared to about 1 in 5 white and Asian children. And if we ask who lives in high and very high opportunity neighborhoods, almost 2/3 of all white and Asian children, and only about 1 in 5 African American and Latino kids live in high opportunity neighborhoods. So the neighborhood where one resides and the opportunities there is a powerful predictor of outcomes. In fact, research indicates powerfully that segregation, this mechanism, upstream mechanism of racism, is the central driver of racial ethnic differences in socioeconomic status. This is a study by David Cutler and his colleague Glaser, national data for the United States using fancy econometric models. They show statistically, if you could eliminate residential segregation, you would completely erase Black-white differences in income, in education, and in unemployment, and reduce Black-white differences in single motherhood by 2/3. All of those are driven not by whether the population is lazy or not, but by the access to opportunity at a neighborhood level. More recently, Raj Chetty, another Harvard economist, has done an intergenerational analysis. He's looked at Black and white children, looked at the household income in which they start life, and controlling for household income. He finds that in 99% of census tracts in the United States, 99%, Black boys have lower earnings than white boys, even when they started out life at the same levels of household income. Why? Because they live in neighborhoods that differ in access to opportunity. Black boys do just as well as white boys in neighborhoods with good resources. The problem is those such neighborhoods are few and far between in the United States. So these data are telling us about the power of one mechanism of structural racism, not the only one, that the racial inequities in income and education that we see that matter for life and health do not reflect a broken system, but they reflect a carefully crafted system functioning as planned, successfully implementing social policies, many of which are rooted in racism. The inequities we see that drive the inequities in health in the United States and globally, the mechanisms vary across contexts, but there are similar mechanisms in every society. They are not accidents, they are not acts of God. Racism has produced a truly rigged system in the United States and elsewhere. And segregation not only leads to differences in socioeconomic status, but in this review paper, we looked at the multiple ways in which segregation affects access to high quality medical care. In segregated neighborhoods, we have the concentration of Black and brown low-income populations who, because of their jobs, have low levels of health insurance coverage. And the providers there are overworked and also have reduced ability to transfer their patients to specialty care. There are fewer pharmacies in these poor segregated neighborhoods, and pharmacies have less access to the medication that their patients need. Hospitals in those neighborhoods, studies show, are more likely to close. And so we are looking at a context, segregated neighborhoods, where there are results in delays in care and the receipt of suboptimal care by the residents who live there. Research also indicates that when you're low in economic status and you live in disadvantaged segregated neighborhoods, that leads to higher levels of exposure and greater clustering of economic stressors and psychosocial stressors and physical and chemical stressors. Here's one example of a study that showed this, a probability sample of adults for the city of Chicago, but this is true more generally. And we found that compared to whites, Blacks and US-born Latinos had higher levels of major life events, like the death of a loved one, higher levels of financial stressors, like difficulty making ends meet at the end of the month, higher levels of relationship stressors, like others making too many demands on you, and higher levels of neighborhood stress, like having your home broken into or being robbed. African Americans and US-born Latinos not only had higher levels of the individual stressors, but they also had greater clustering of those stressors compared to whites. So we've talked about one mechanism of structural upstream racism, residential segregation, and the impact it has. And I emphasize it's only one mechanism, but a really powerful one. I also want to talk about discrimination at the individual level and the impact it might have. Martin Luther King said that discrimination is a hellhound that gnaws at Negroes in every waking moment of their lives, declaring that the lie of their inferiority is accepted as a truth in the society dominated them? Well, this is a hypothesis that could be tested. And I thought it was important to put on the table measures of discrimination, that we could test this hypothesis, that does this subjective experience of discrimination, of being treated unfairly or badly because of one's race or other social factors, does that have a negative effect on health? And this was a paper we published in 1997, where we published the Everyday Discrimination Scale, suggesting that discrimination seemed to be a neglected psychosocial stressor that not only adversely impacted health, but also helped to explain that residual effect of socioeconomic status, of race that existed after we had taken socioeconomic status into account. And this is the Everyday Discrimination Scale. It doesn't capture all measures of discrimination, but it captures the little indignities: being treated with less courtesy and respect, receiving poorer service than others at restaurants or stores, people acting as if they think you are not smart, they're afraid of you, they think you are dishonest. A lot of little indignities. Professor Chester Pierce, an African-American psychiatrist at Harvard University, back in 1970, said that these assaults to Black dignity and Black hope, that's what he called these factors that are listed on the Everyday Discrimination Scale. It didn't exist then, but that's what he was describing. He said any single one of them may not be gross. In fact, the major vehicle for racism in this country, he suggested, was offenses done, at least major at the interpersonal level, offenses done to Blacks by whites in this sort of gratuitous, never-ending way. And he called these offenses microaggressions. Well, just to illustrate how powerfully these microaggressions adversely impact health, I'm going to show you on this slide what research has found. There are now more than 450 peer-reviewed published papers from around the world using the Everyday Discrimination Scale. And there are studies that find that scoring high in everyday discrimination is linked to incident, that's new cases of metabolic syndrome, of cardiovascular disease, of breast cancer, of type 2 diabetes. It leads to higher levels of the use of risk behavior that can have adverse impacts on health. It leads to multiple subclinical indicators of disease, like coronary artery calcification, or intima media thickness, or visceral fat, or heart rate variation, or AFib. It leads to associated with elevated high blood pressure, with poorer sleep, with higher levels of inflammation, higher levels of cortisol, shorter telomere length, higher levels of allostatic load, a marker of biological dysregulation across multiple physiological systems. Higher levels of everyday discrimination also predicts obesity and weight gain over time. It predicts less engagement with the healthcare system. Persons who report everyday discrimination less likely to follow through on their providers' recommendations. And it predicts poorer mental health, psychological well-being, but also DSM-defined psychiatric disorders and higher levels of emotional distress. So just this slide just summarizes just some of the outcomes that everyday discrimination predicts. And there's this much larger literature on discrimination. And we now have studies from the United States, the United Kingdom, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand that find in each of these contexts, when you look at racial differences in health and you adjust them for income and education, and there is a residual effect of race, that residual effect is further reduced when you add a measure of discrimination to the model. And when I read the qualitative research on the subjective experience of discrimination, it became clear to me that persons were affected not only by actual exposure to discrimination, but also by the threat of discrimination. And this is true for other stressors, that the threat of exposure can also be a source of psychosocial stress. And so I also developed a scale called the Heightened Vigilance Scale, that after individuals who ask questions about everyday discrimination, we assess the extent to which, because of these experiences, they think in advance about the kind of problems they are likely to experience. They try to prepare for possible insults before leaving home. They feel they always have to be careful about their parents and other factors to get good service or avoid being harassed. They carefully watch what you say. They try to avoid certain social situations and places. What emerges here is a higher level of vigilance. The reality that individuals are unable to relax because of the threat of discrimination within their environment. There haven't been many studies using the heightened vigilance scale, but I'll illustrate one of those studies that documented not only does everyday discrimination predict higher levels of hypertension, but higher levels of vigilance because of everyday discrimination also predicts hypertension. So we find both the actual exposure to discrimination matters, but also the threat, the perceived threat of exposure also matters independent of the actual exposure. And then we have a body of research that suggests there are multiple hidden ways in which stressors linked to race and racism adversely affect health. One study found that over 70% of African American mothers were very concerned that their children might be harmed by the police. Well, what does that level of anxiety and concern mean for their lives? Well, a study published just in 2021, looking at mothers in 20 cities in the United States, found that 1/4 of their children, almost 23%, almost one in four, had been stopped by the police by age 15. And mothers of youth who were stopped by the police are more than twice as likely to report depression and anxiety-related sleep difficulties. Another study done by Professor Brendisha Tynes from University of Southern California has looked at Black and Latinx adolescents and has assessed the extent to which they have viewed online images of someone of their racial group being beaten, arrested or detained, or being shot by the police. And higher levels of exposure to these online traumatic experiences leads to higher levels of PTSD and depressive symptoms. And here is a study I did with other colleagues where we linked a database that contained every police shooting in the United States over a 3-year period of time, and linked it to another database that provided us the mental health of the population in every state. And we were able to document that every police shooting of an unarmed Black person led to worse mental health for not just the family and friends, but for the entire Black population in the state in which that incident had occurred for the next 3 months. So we have seen spillover effects of the racism in the larger society on the health of the population. And researchers are documenting that all of these psychosocial stressors, combined with the stress of discrimination, is leading to a phenomenon that some are calling accelerated aging or premature aging or biological weathering. What they are describing is that in these United States, African Americans is the population most studied, but we believe these patterns are true for other populations of color, that your chronological age doesn't only capture how long you've lived, but your age is also telling us how long you've been exposed to bad environmental conditions and how physiologically compromised you have become because of those exposures. So the cumulative impact of repeated exposure to psychological, social, physical, chemical stressors in residential, occupational, and other environments, and coping with these stressors are leading African Americans and others to literally age biologically more rapidly than the white population. Some studies show that at midlife, there's a 10-year gap in biological aging between Blacks and whites. Some show a 7.5-year gap. And one phenomenon produced by this as well is the earlier onset of disease. Here is the example of high blood pressure. And you can see at every age, starting very young, but let's focus even at age 50 to 64, 61% of African Americans have hypertension compared to 41% of whites. And this reflects this cumulative adverse impact of all of these stressors, including the stress of racism. So we've talked about segregation. We've talked about individual level discrimination. There's also discrimination or racism deeply embedded in the culture. And that racism in the culture leads to stereotypes, and negative assumptions that triggers implicit as well as explicit biases and stigma. And these negative assumptions and stereotypes trigger racial discrimination. And one domain in which that has been documented is in the area of medical care. One of our earlier talks mentioned the unequal treatment report published in 2003 by the Institute of Medicine, now called the National Academy of Medicine. And 20 years later, we are almost on 20 years later after this report was released in 2002, published in 2003, we have strong evidence that there's racial bias in medical care and that persists today. In the interest of time, I will share with you just one recent study. This is a study published in 2020 of 1.8 million hospital births in the state of Florida. When cared for by white doctors, Black babies, this was 1.8 million births studied over a long period of time. Black babies are 3 times more likely than white newborns to die in the hospital. The disparity is cut in half when Black babies are cared for by a Black doctor. This study doesn't give us the mechanisms that are operative here, but it clearly suggests something is dramatically wrong. So what can we do about these racial inequities in health? I wrote a paper with Dr. Lisa Cooper, and we had as a subtitle of our paper, using the knowledge we already know, we already have to take action, because there's a lot of evidence that points us to solutions that would work to, in fact, reduce these inequities in health. We need to think of what we can do to build more health into the delivery of health care, and we need to think of how can we create what I call communities of opportunity that would minimize, neutralize, and dismantle the systems of racism that, in fact, have created inequities in health in the first place. So let's talk about what we can do to build more health into the delivery of medical care. One of the things we need to do that's a no-brainer, we need to ensure access to care for all. This will not solve the problem, but there are instances in which increasing access to care would make a difference in providing timely and early preventive care for everyone in the population. We also need to ensure we provide high quality care. And one of the keys to doing that, certainly not the only one, but one of the keys to doing that is diversifying the workforce to meet the needs of all patients. I want to share with you the findings from a randomized controlled trial, highest quality of scientific evidence. They took 1,300 Black men recruited in Oakland, California, given a coupon for free health screening at a Saturday morning clinic where they could get screening for multiple outcomes. But when they got to the clinic, the men were randomized to see a Black doctor or not. And what the study found was those African American men who saw a Black doctor were more likely to talk about other health problems. They were more likely to do the screening for diabetes. They were more likely to get a flu vaccine. They were more likely to do the screening for cholesterol. So we see a pattern of greater engagement with the healthcare system when in fact there was racial concordance. We have a long way to go. In 2014, there were 27 fewer African American males in the first year of medical school across all medical schools in the United States than in 1978. Yes, in the mid-1960s, 2.9% of all practicing physicians in the US were Black. In 2019, 5% of physicians are Black, 6% are Latino, 0.3% are Indigenous. We have a long way to go, but this has to be an important priority for not just the medical workforce, but the healthcare workforce much more broadly. I have some good news though. Another study from Northern California that found large racial disparities in a sample of patients with HIV/AIDS. There were racial disparities in the receipt of the antiretroviral therapy, racial disparities in the patients following through and taking the therapy as they were supposed to, and racial disparities in viral suppression, that the therapy was working to do what it was supposed to do. However, the researchers looked at the data in a new way. they had administered a measure of cultural competence to the providers. And what they were able to document, that the racial disparities existed only among patients for providers whose cultural competence was low. When cultural competence was high, there were in fact no racial disparities in the health outcomes in this specific study. And the study doesn't tell us how to get to high levels of cultural competency, but if we look at the items on the scale, it gives us an idea of the image of what are the components of cultural competency. Here are some of the items from the cultural competency scale. Providers who scored high on that scale are providers who agreed that family and friends were as important to health as doctors. Providers who said social history contributed to how they care for their patients. Providers who said they were familiar with the lay beliefs their patients have. Providers who said they asked their patients about alternative therapies they use. Providers who said they find out what their patients think is the cause of their illness. And providers who said they involve their patients in decisions about their health care. So we have a goal while we seek to recruit and develop a more diverse healthcare workforce. We also need to work on increasing cultural competence. What else do we need to do within the healthcare domain? We need to provide care that addresses the social context. The World Health Organization asks, what do we accomplish if all we do is treat illness and send people back to live in the same conditions that made them sick in the first place? A recent report from the National Academy of Medicine points out that there are many opportunities for healthcare systems and healthcare professionals to address the social needs of their patients. And this suggests a 5A approach, that individuals at the individual level, healthcare providers can ask patients, engage in activities that raise awareness levels, ask questions about their exposure to social risk and assets. And then they can, at an individual level, adjust what is done, adjust the delivery of care to accommodate the barriers that patients face. They can also provide assistance by connecting patients with relevant resources. And then at the community level, healthcare systems can align their resources within the community to facilitate the deployment of social assets to make a difference in communities. And they can also play a role in advocacy activities to solve the problems and address the underlying social determinants that cause problems for their patients. But the bottom line is, as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's commission eloquently articulated, that there is more to health than healthcare. And if we solve the healthcare problems alone, there will still be racial inequities in health. Most policymakers in the United States, when they think about health, they think about medical care and personal responsibility and affordability and coverage and access. And those are all important, but we need to think of the broader living and working conditions in homes and communities, and the social and economic opportunities and resources that also are the drivers of health. And that's why, in addition to doing interventions within the healthcare space, we need to create these communities of opportunity that I mentioned earlier. And that is, we need to address place-linked determinants of health. We need to develop strategies to enrich the quality of neighborhood environments, to increase economic development in poor areas, to improve housing quality and the safety of neighborhood environments. And these effective efforts to improve population health and to address the social determinants of health must be planned and executed, working in partnership with communities and building on community strengths and building on community resources and resilience factors and seeking to enhance community capacity. I think it's really important to realize that communities are suffering right now and that there are resources that make a difference in communities right now, and we need to lift up those resources even as we work on solutions that are further upstream. I want to give you 3 examples of things that are making a difference as communities struggle with the inequalities they face. Here is a study of teenagers, African-American teens in rural Georgia. And this study found that those teens who scored high on discrimination, self-reported discrimination, at age 16, 17, and 18. By age 20, I didn't say age 40, I didn't say age 30. By age 20, they had higher levels of stress hormones, cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, systolic blood pressure, inflammation, and BMI. However, among those teens who were embedded in a network of rich emotional and instrumental support from their family, their friends, and their teachers, there was no relationship between exposure to discrimination and the negative biomarkers. So the social ties cushioned the negative effects of discrimination on their health. A national study of African Americans found that 3 aspects of religious involvement: frequency of religious attendance, relying on others at one's place of worship for social support, and seeking religious guidance in everyday life, reduced the negative effects of the stress of racial discrimination on mental health. So then more and more interventions being based in religious organizations within communities that can be a source of support for individuals. And here is another study of a First Nation population in Canada. At the time of this study, Native youth in Canada had one of the highest rates of youth suicide in the world. But the researchers who were studying this phenomenon were struck by the fact that although as a group, this population had very high rates of youth suicide, half of 196 First Nation communities had no youth suicides at all over a multi-year period of time. And so they wondered, what is it that distinguishes those communities that didn't have youth suicides or had lower levels of youth suicide? And they identified 5 markers of challenging the government, the federal government of Canada, for titles to land, for the right of self-governance, for the ability to manage their own services like education and police and fire and healthcare, and having a building in their community where they taught the next generation their history and their culture. Each of these markers of advocacy, of protest, of empowerment and cultural affirmation was associated with a lower risk of youth suicide. And this study found a strong dose-response relationship. The more of these markers of advocacy, protest, empowerment, and cultural affirmation, the lower the risk of youth suicide. So all of these are powerful resources that are operating at the community level. But tangibly, how do we build these communities of opportunity? There are multiple things we need to do. I don't have time to discuss each one in detail, but I want to emphasize, invest in early childhood, reduce childhood poverty. We need to enhance income and employment opportunities. We need to improve neighborhood and housing conditions. We need to enhance economic opportunity. Let me illustrate a few examples quickly. Addressing early childhood opportunities for children. Here is a randomized controlled trial done in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, the Abecedarian Project, where they took poor children, 80% of them African American, and randomized them at birth to an early childhood program. They went to a center where they received was a safe and nurturing environment, good nutrition, good intellectual stimulation, good pediatric care. By age 21, they have better academic performance. They have a better success with vocational assets in terms of jobs, lower levels of drug use, lower levels of depression, and by their mid-30s, remember, this is a program just birth through 5. They're in nurturing these babies got birth through 5. By their mid-30s, they had lower levels of risk factors for cardiovascular disease and metabolic disease, with the effects stronger for males than for females. Here's one example of the systolic blood pressure in the control group, a control group that didn't get the program compared to the intervention group, marked differences in blood pressure, but all on multiple indicators of metabolic disease linked to what happened early in life. We also therefore need to reduce childhood poverty in the United States. And I point you to the National Academy of Sciences volume that recently provided a roadmap to reducing childhood poverty by 50% in the United States, suggesting a number of strategies that can be implemented to reduce childhood poverty. We have the evidence, we know what will work, we just need the political will to do it. We also need to improve neighborhood and housing conditions. We have high quality evidence. Here is data from a randomized control trial that took residents of public housing, randomized them to move to a less poor neighborhood, no health intervention. 10 to 15 years later, those who were moved, just changing the neighborhood environment, led to, in fact, improved health. Sometimes we think some neighborhoods are so disadvantaged, there is nothing that can be done. So I want to share with you one example from Eastlake, Atlanta, that shows dramatic neighborhood transformation is possible in the United States. It's the purpose-built communities model. Come with me to Eastlake Meadows in 1995, where there is in fact, a public housing project where African Americans live, a very high crime rate. The units, many of them, 40% unlivable, only 13% of adults gainfully employed. The local elementary school, one of the worst performing in the entire state of Georgia. This has been completely transformed, and there has been in the villages of Eastlake, the new project where this housing project was torn down and a new housing compound built, a 90% reduction in violent crime, high quality mixed income housing, all able-bodied adults employed, and the school is one of the best, elementary school, one of the best performing in the state of Georgia, although 60% of the students qualify for reduced price meals, which means they're coming from poor households. This model may not be perfect, but it shows that it can be done, that it is possible for us to address all the challenges faced by poor communities simultaneously. We can work across silos. We can do it. We can have a comprehensive, integrated model of addressing place-based problems. We can provide high-quality education to poor kids. We can develop mixed income, affordable housing for low-income households, and we can provide a wraparound of services that meet the needs of the community. And the purpose-built communities model, they are providing free technical assistance to any community in the United States who wants to replicate their model, and over 20 communities have taken them up on the offer and are implemented a purpose-built community in disadvantaged communities in the United States. So we have a lot of evidence of strategies that work. What is holding us back? What are the barriers that we have to address? I think we have three main challenges, and they are linked. One is we need to raise awareness levels of the challenges that the inequities, in fact, exist. 50% of American adults, even in the time of COVID, are unaware that racial inequities exist. But we have to think of how we talk about these inequities. There was a recent study in social science and medicine that shows that for people who became aware that there were racial disparities in COVID, white people who became aware were less likely to engage in taking part in any protective strategies to protect them that COVID. They thought because there were, in fact, inequities that were disproportionately affecting populations of color, that they were not at risk, missing the point that because the majority of Americans are white, the majority of people who have died from COVID have been white. We also need to build a science base that will guide us in developing the political will to address racial and other social inequities in health. This is the real challenge. We have evidence, we know what works. How do we build the political will to address these inequities? And relatedly, because a key to building the political will is to build empathy, to identify how to tell the story of the challenges of the disadvantaged in ways that resonate with the public. We also need to educate the American public that it's about all of us. It's not about us versus them. Here is a paper recently published with other colleagues about the effect of whiteness on the health of whites, the effect of racism on the health of whites. Yes, racism does have some positive benefits for many white people, but racism also had adverse impacts on many whites. Dismantling the structures of racism will provide benefits for the entire society, including whites. And we have to keep in mind that although, for example, the levels of poverty, the percentage of people who are poor It's 1 in 5 for African Americans and almost 1 in 4 for Native Americans, 17% of Latinos, 8% of whites, and 8% of Asians. But if we look again at who are poor in terms of millions, there's almost twice as many poor whites as poor African Americans, 16 million poor whites compared to 8.5 million poor African Americans and 10.4 million poor Latinos. So we are talking about working together and creating these communities of opportunity to reverse racial injustice will be beneficial to people of all races. The policies that will benefit communities of color will improve conditions for everyone, including many poor and working class whites. I want to conclude my talk by acknowledging the importance of mentors in my life and making the plea that academic organizations and research organizations like NIH needs to put in place structures that will identify, nurture, and mentor the next generation of scientists. All of my personal hard work and the support of my family and friends and divine blessings would not have successfully launched my career without a minority fellowship from the University of Michigan. Yes, I am an affirmative action baby, and the Supreme Court is going to rule on affirmative action, and given the makeup of this court, we know what they are likely to do. Without affirmative action, I would not be here and would not be given this talk today. But I also want to talk about my mentor, Professor James S. House, who recently retired from the University of Michigan. A mentor who cared, who went out of his way to support minorities and women, a mentor who had a vision and commitment, and we need to put structures in place now to ensure the creation of leaders for tomorrow. But it's not just one mentor. In addition to James House here, who chaired my dissertation committee, another influential mentor in my life was Professor Ronald C. Kessler, who ran a NIH-funded training program that I was an affiliate trainee with for my 4 years of graduate school, and he played an important role in shaping my experience as a professional as well. I had another sociologist, Professor Walter Allen, who also served on my dissertation committee, now at UCLA, and Dr. Barbara Israel from the University of Michigan was on my dissertation committee, as well as Victor Hawthorne, who was the chair of epidemiology at Michigan at the time. So these are also persons who played an important role in mentoring me. But it takes a village. It takes a big village. I highlight 3 other mentors who played a key role. Dr. Norman Miles, who gave me key advice about helping me to select a good graduate school, University of Michigan, to go to. Dr. Alden Morris, a faculty at the University of Michigan at my time, who played a key role in helping me to make wise decisions about employment opportunities. And most profoundly of all of the 3 here is Professor James Jackson, who we lost too early in life recently, who was my mid-career mentor, who mentored me and helped me develop my work on racism and health, and mentored me in so many powerful ways. Without these mentors, I would not be here today. I leave you with 2 quotations. Martin Luther King said, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It understands it's an edifice which produces beggars need restructuring." There are many edifices that produce beggars, and we need to make a commitment to restructuring them. And finally, the words of Robert Kennedy. Each time a man or woman stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And those ripples can build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. I hope with my presentation and all the other really insightful presentations we've heard today, that each one of us would leave this place with a new commitment to be a tiny ripple of hope, so that together we can sweep down the mighty walls of oppression and resistance and improve health for all and reduce inequities in health in these United States. Thank you so much for your time and attention today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for that inspiring and comprehensive talk. As you might imagine, we have quite a few questions. There are also quite a few expressions of appreciation in the chat, which I won't read out each one, but there are quite a few there. So these questions have been coming in throughout the entirety of your talk. So I'm going to try to put them put them in the context of where you were in your talk when they came in. The first question, I'll see if I can do that. The first questions I think came in when you were talking about the income and wealth gaps. And there was some curiosity as to what those numbers would look like if you also added gender to the mix. I'm imagining that the gap would be even wider, but I don't know if you know those numbers off the top of your head.
The gap wider. I'm reporting the data the way they are typically reported by these national statistical agencies, but we know that by gender, just in the United States in general, things have gotten better. I'll tell you, when my career started and I would teach an undergraduate course, this is in the late 1980s, I would show national data for the United States showing that on average in the United States, a male in the US with a high school completion had higher levels of income than a woman on average in the US with high school completion, a woman with a college degree, a woman with graduate training. That was true in the 1980s and the early 1990s. Mm-hmm. That is no longer true today, but women still earn on average less than men do, and that's true within the populations of color, although within populations of color we have more females actively engaged in the labor force than males, but that's linked to another dimension, another set of challenges that exist.
We could probably talk for another hour or so on those topics. So there were, I believe these came in when you were kind of talking about neighborhood and geography effects. So are desegregation policies the best approach to these problems, or would policies that focused on increasing resources and opportunities directly in the neighborhoods of Blacks and Latinos perhaps work better?
We don't have enough experience of doing either of those things well that we can empirically talk definitively of what would work. What we do know is that we do need to dismantle those structures that exist. And certainly one way would be to have a Marshall Plan I have sometimes called for disadvantaged communities where we enrich the infrastructure. At the same time, is it truly possible for us to have separate but unequal? And if people without political clout and will are not part of those communities, will we really obtain the kind of true equality, or will we just have separate and unequal? There was a New York Times magazine article late last year that looked at the case of trying to do desegregation or changing the boundaries of the Minneapolis school district. And in a very progressive town where signs of Black Lives Matter were everywhere, when it came to restructuring the school district to bring about integration, just at the school level, education level, there were massive sales of homes in the white neighborhoods, which were now going to be linked to have to send the kids to a school that had been historically Black. And basically, the plan failed. So the question is, we face a challenge as a society as to how do we bring about those opportunities. Certainly, we need to invest and change the underlying structures within communities. Desegregation would be one strategy. Do we have the political will to do that? Is there such a hidden racism? In the last presidential election campaign, Donald Trump quoted, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes in veiled language, the threat of minorities moving into communities if the Democrats got elected. And 10 million more people voted for him the second time than the first time. So we face a real political conundrum there in terms of how do we move forward. We have to change the current understandings and cultures and priorities of us as individuals and as communities in this country.
This question is about your everyday discrimination scale. So this person has used your scale and says that respondents sometimes spent time ruminating on whether an experience was due to racism or not. Have there been studies that developed a measure of how likely a person is to attribute an experience to discrimination, or that measure the time and energy individuals end up needing to expend to try to figure out whether an experience was due to racism and the relationships between these and health?
It's a really good question. African-American psychiatrist Carl Bell in Chicago, who passed away recently also, talked about the extent to which one stressor that African Americans and others experience with terms of discrimination is trying to identify the source of this discrimination. That you know what happened, you're not sure why. And there's an extra burden of rumination of trying to figure out, was it my race? Was it my gender? Is this person having a bad day? Is this person just a nasty person? I mean, and he sees that as that rumination and trying to identify the source as one additional source of stress. There's not been a lot of work doing that. When I was developing measures of discrimination, James Jackson, who was working with me, we made a concerted decision not to ask the questions. If you note the questions, we do not ask, were you treated with less courtesy and respect because of your race? We ask you, first of all, did you have the experience? We want to get a neutral experience. There is research that suggests that making race salient can lead to over-report or under-report. So we wanted to get a clean description without any values built into it. And then at the end, we asked people, what do you think was the main experience or the main reason for those experiences? And it was our way to try to navigate this difficult challenge. The evidence is not, I would say, all in at this point, but the weight of the evidence now suggests that once someone reports a negative experience, attribution does not seem to make much difference. So whether they attribute it to their race or their sexual orientation or their gender or their age or their religious background, it's the generic perception of unfair treatment that seems in general to be the driver of effects. There are some exceptions in the literature, but I think the weight of the evidence is the generic perception is what's important. But there's more work to be done. These were our opening salvos in trying to get at these phenomena. There's more work to be done, and the point raised is an important one.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. No, I lost the question. Oh, so this was an interesting comment more, but it would be interesting to hear what you have to say about it. One possible approach to increase diversity in healthcare is to increase the number of medical schools at historically Black colleges and universities. There are just not enough spaces at the majority white schools to get rid of the present shortages in Black physicians in the United States.
I mean, it's an interesting idea. I do think that the fundamental problem is not so much what happens at medical school admissions, although we can think of reforms that need to be done in that space. But I think the fundamental problem is to build a pipeline. We are not investing as a society in strengthening the quality of education that individuals are getting in segregated communities. There are dramatic differences in the quality of educational exposure in elementary school and high school. And I think really we need to put much more investment of effort and energy into building the pipeline, ensuring that individuals have access to high quality elementary education and they are prepared to be successful in medical school and in any other career within the health field or any other field that they would like to go in. So that to me is the biggest priority, our new commitments to improve the quality of education and provide high quality educational preparation for all. And certainly we can think of providing nurturing environments for those students, but building the pipeline is to me the biggest area of need.
Thank you. So we're about at the end of the Q&A period, but I think that there's opportunity for kind of combining a couple here. So we're asked, what is the likelihood that the government, national, state, or local levels will introduce or support policies to eliminate racial health inequities? And do any of the participants here have or know how to help us develop, how to help develop the political will to do this?
This is a really, really big question. I mean, there are examples. I'll give you an example. I didn't have time to talk about it. In the state of Delaware, implemented a program that provided everyone, regardless of income and insurance coverage, access to colorectal cancer screening. And then after they had a screening program running for 2 years, they added colorectal cancer treatment. Up to, if you had incomes up to 6.5 times the poverty level, you could get colorectal cancer screening and treatment free in the state of Delaware. And within 6 years, they eliminated the gap in the racial gap in screening, increasing screening for African Americans and whites, no racial gap in screening. They eliminated the racial gap in the incidence, the black-white gap in the incidence of colorectal cancer in the state of Delaware, and they eliminated 90% of the gap in colorectal cancer mortality. And they did all of this with the program literally saving the state money, because it reduced the treatment of colorectal cancer within the state. So it can be done. There are examples in local areas of programs that are effective. There's no reason why I think something like the purpose-built communities model that is now in 20 different communities across the United States could not be brought up to a national level. I think we need political will. What is the barrier? So I mentioned empathy, and I didn't elaborate on it. And this may be the last point I'll make, so we have come to the end. And that is, research on every continent has shown us that there is a gap in empathy. We have more empathy. We feel more compassion. And this is studies that show people looking at the pain of someone else suffering and looking at not what they say about how they feel, but looking at their brain imagery, looking at what's happening within the brain. And basically, we have more empathy for someone of our own racial group than someone of another group. Research in the United States, one study found among white children at age 5, there's no racial gap in empathy. By age 7, it tends to be evident. By age 10, it is pronounced. And so our challenge is, how can we learn to talk about the challenges of the disadvantaged in a way that breaks through these barriers and really builds compassion? When Americans feel compassion, as they do for the challenges in Ukraine, for example, or they do when some disaster strikes somewhere around, thousands of miles away around the world, and we will send money on our cell phones to meet that crisis. When we feel compassion for the problems others have, we act. So how do we tell the story of the challenges of disadvantaged populations in a way that emotionally connects and builds empathy and lets us to walk away from it saying, this is unacceptable in our country, we will do something about it. That's what we need, and we need to work with communication experts and political scientists to identify how do we do that in terms of telling the story of racial inequities in health. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And I do hope you have a quick chance to skim through the chat, because there's probably close to 200 expressions of appreciation and thanks for your work and for the talk that you gave today. And I'm certain that OBSSR thanks you for coming and presenting today as well. On that note, I'm going to turn it over to my OBSSR colleague, Dr. Wendy Smith, for some wrap-up comments.
Hey, thank you. I know we're at the end of the program. I just have a couple quick comments and announcements to wrap up. First, I want to thank Drs. Elwoods and Spots for moderating the Q&A sessions, and thank you to our presenters, Dr. Brazil, Kristoff, Homan, Jackson, and Palamaru for your excellent presentations. And a very special thank you to Dr. Williams, our 15th NIH Matilda White Riley Distinguished Lecturer. I want to thank all of you who joined online today as well. If you have colleagues who are unable to join, there will be a recording of today's webinar available. It'll take about a month, and you can find it on the OBSSR website at obssr.od.nih.gov. Also, please mark your calendars to attend some of OBSSR's upcoming events. The next OBSSR Directors webinar will be held on the 19th of July at 2 o'clock. It'll feature Dr. Irene Dankwa-Mulan, Deputy Chief Health Officer for IBM Watson Health, who will be presenting on her most recent paper titled Leveraging Data-Driven Advanced Analytics and Artificial Intelligence Technologies to Address Social and Behavioral Determinants for Health Equity. Another OBSSR Directors webinar is coming up in September on the 27th, also at 2. And this one will feature Dr. Emily Falk from the University of Pennsylvania. Her presentation will discuss health communication and behavior change and how health messaging can affect behaviors such as alcohol and tobacco use. You may also want to save the date for our 2022 NIH Behavioral and Social Sciences Research Festival. This will be held on Friday, December 2nd. Details will follow. Please subscribe to our listserv to receive updates on these events and upcoming events. You'll find that on our website. And this concludes the 15th Annual NIH Matilda White Riley Behavioral and Social Sciences Honors. I want to thank you all for attending and have a nice rest of your day.